He promised to protect their children. Instead, he became their nightmare. What happens when the man parents trust most becomes the predator they never saw coming? Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where every story runs darker and truth cuts colder than fiction. I'm so glad you're here. Wherever you're watching from, you're part of the family. If you enjoy the stories, a like, comment, or subscribe helps keep the truth alive. Have you subscribed yet? I'll wait. Done? Perfect. Thank you. Now, this is the story of the devil in the daycare. They called him Tio Chris, Uncle Chris, the gentle soul who sang lullabies and wiped away tears. But behind the puppet shows and finger paintings, Christopher Chavez Cuellar was orchestrating something so vile, so calculated, that even hardened detectives would struggle to sleep after seeing the evidence. This is the story of a monster who didn't lurk in shadows. He thrived in plain sight. Surrounded by innocents he systematically destroyed. Tonight, we descend into the mind of a predator who turned a sanctuary into a hunting ground. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Hermosillo, Sonora, a sun-scorched city where the desert bleeds into civilization, where families work long hours and trust becomes currency. When parents dropped their children off at the daycare center each morning, they weren't just leaving them with any caregiver. They were leaving them with Christopher Chavez Cuellar, a 29-year-old man whose warm smile and gentle demeanor made him seem like a guardian angel sent specifically for their little ones. The mothers loved him. The fathers trusted him. The children ran to him with open arms. Christopher had that rare quality, an ability to make people feel safe. He spoke softly, moved carefully, and always seemed to know exactly what each child needed. When little Sophia wouldn't stop crying on her first day, Christopher was there with a stuffed rabbit and a song. When Miguel scraped his knee on the playground, Christopher was the first to kneel down, bandage ready, voice soothing. He remembered birthdays. He knew favorite colors. He made parents feel that their most precious treasures were in capable, caring hands. But capability and care were never Christopher's true motivations. What parents saw as dedication was actually surveillance. What they interpreted as kindness was merely patience. Christopher Chavez Cuellar hadn't chosen this profession out of love for children. He'd chosen it for access. Unlimited, trusted, unquestioned access to the most vulnerable human beings imaginable. The daycare center itself was modest. A converted house with brightly painted walls, cartoon characters dancing across the entrance, and a small playground out back where swings creaked in the hot wind. Inside, the rooms smelled of crayons and juice boxes, the floors scattered with building blocks and picture books. It looked like every other daycare in every other neighborhood. That was precisely the point. Normalcy was Christopher's greatest camouflage. He'd been working there for 3 years when the darkness he'd been carefully concealing began to consume him entirely. For 3 years, he'd played the role perfectly, arriving early, staying late, volunteering for extra shifts. The center's director praised his dedication. Parents recommended him to their friends. He'd even won a Caregiver of the Year certificate that hung proudly on the wall near the cubbies where children stored their tiny backpacks. Nobody knew that Christopher's phone contained thousands of images that would make even seasoned investigators physically ill. Nobody suspected that during nap time, when the room fell quiet and other staff members took their breaks, Christopher would position himself next to specific children he'd already selected. Nobody imagined that the gentle hands that tied shoelaces and distributed snacks were the same hands committing unspeakable violations. The selection process was methodical. Christopher didn't target randomly. He studied, evaluated, and chose with the precision of a predator who understood that patience yielded the greatest rewards. He looked for the quietest children, the ones who wouldn't immediately report strange behavior. He identified the families who worked the longest hours, whose rushed morning drop-offs and exhausted evening pickups meant less time for detailed questions about their child's day. He noticed which parents were going through divorces, dealing with sick relatives, or juggling multiple jobs, the ones whose attention was fractured, whose guilt about working made them eager to believe everything was fine. One of his first victims was a 4-year-old girl named Valentina. She had enormous brown eyes and a habit of sucking her thumb when she got tired. Her mother worked double shifts at a hospital, her father was deployed with the military, and she was being raised primarily by her grandmother who had arthritis so severe that dropping off and picking up Valentina was physically painful. Christopher noticed all of this. He noticed that Valentina's grandmother never lingered for conversations, never asked detailed questions, and seemed relieved just to have the child safely supervised. Valentina became his focus. He began giving her extra attention, letting her be line leader more often, giving her the pink crayon she loved, sitting next to her during story time. The grandmother noticed how attached Valentina seemed to Tio Chris and felt grateful. The little girl had so much upheaval in her young life. At least she had one stable, caring presence. Except Christopher Chavez Cuellar wasn't stable, and he certainly wasn't caring. During one afternoon nap time, while other children slept on their small mats and the co-worker supervising the adjacent room was distracted by a phone call, Christopher moved Valentina to a corner that security cameras didn't quite reach. He'd studied those camera angles for months. He knew every blind spot in the building, and he'd created more by strategically placing storage boxes and rearranging furniture in ways that seemed innocent but served his purposes perfectly. What happened in those minutes would become part of the evidence that would eventually destroy him. But for now, for weeks and then months, Christopher operated with impunity. Valentina never told anyone. She was too young to fully understand what was happening, too confused by the fact that Tio Chris was doing things that felt wrong but telling her they were special games, and their secret. He'd give her candy afterward. He'd let her play with the tablet when other children couldn't. He'd condition her silence with rewards and threats so subtle that a 4-year-old brain couldn't even process them as threats. This was just one child. There were others, so many others. Christopher kept records, a digital catalog of his crimes that he organized with the same meticulous attention to detail that made him an excellent daycare worker. He had folders on his phone labeled with innocent-sounding names, but the contents were anything but innocent. Photographs, videos, timestamps. He documented everything, driven by an arrogance so profound that he never truly believed he'd be caught. He was too careful, too clever, too trusted. He even exchanged materials with other predators online, part of a network of monsters who traded innocence like baseball cards, who encouraged each other's depravity and shared techniques for avoiding detection. In these digital spaces, Christopher wasn't Tio Chris, the beloved caregiver. He was Carlitos HMO, a username that meant nothing to anyone except the other predators who knew him by his contributions to their vile community. The daycare center had policies, of course, background checks, 2 adult rules, training on recognizing abuse. But policies are only as strong as their enforcement, and Christopher had become so integral to the center's operation, so trusted by everyone, that rules began to soften around him. If he needed to take a child to the bathroom alone, nobody questioned it. If he volunteered to stay late with the last few kids waiting for pickup, parents were grateful rather than suspicious. If he suggested moving children away from certain areas so they could nap better, staff members thought he was being thoughtful about noise levels. Every violation of protocol was accepted because Christopher had spent 3 years building a reputation that made suspicion seem absurd. He was the person you wanted watching your children. He was the standard against which other caregivers were measured. He was perfect, perfectly evil. The parents who trusted him most would later describe feeling physically sick when they realized how thoroughly they'd been deceived. One mother would tell investigators that she'd actually bragged to other parents about how lucky they were to have Christopher at the center. A father would admit that he'd insisted his wife stop being paranoid when she mentioned feeling slightly uncomfortable about how much time Christopher spent with their daughter. These parents would torture themselves with guilt for years, replaying every interaction, searching for signs they'd missed, wondering if their children would have been spared if only they'd been more suspicious, more vigilant, more willing to trust their instincts. But Christopher Chavez Cuellar had weaponized trust itself. He understood that in a world where stranger danger was constantly emphasized, people had let their guard down around familiar faces. He knew that parents were desperate to believe their children were safe while they worked to provide for those same children. He exploited the fundamental human need to trust someone with our most precious responsibilities. And for 3 years, it worked flawlessly. The daycare continued operating normally. Children played and learned and napped. Parents worked and worried about normal things like picky eating and potty training. Christopher smiled and sang and committed atrocities that these families would spend lifetimes trying to forget. His arrogance grew with each successful violation. He started taking greater risks, keeping his phone on him more often, reviewing his collection during breaks, even filming in increasingly bold locations within the center. The thrill of operating in plain sight became as addictive as the crimes themselves. He was untouchable. He was invisible. He was a monster wearing the most perfect disguise imaginable, the face of someone who loves children. But every predator makes mistakes eventually. Every criminal, no matter how careful, leaves breadcrumbs. And Christopher Chavez Cuellar was about to discover that his perfect disguise had one fatal flaw. He'd become so confident in his invincibility that he'd stopped being quite as careful as he should have been. The walls were about to close in. The monster was about to be exposed. And Hermosillo was about to learn that sometimes the devil doesn't announce himself with horns and a pitchfork. Sometimes he shows up in khaki pants and a polo shirt, with a kind smile and a nickname children love to say. The unraveling began not with a dramatic raid or a brave child's disclosure, but with something far more mundane, a technical investigation into online predator networks that had nothing to do with Christopher Chavez Cuellar, at least not initially. Federal authorities in Mexico, working in conjunction with international agencies tracking child sexual abuse material, had been monitoring certain online platforms known for illegal content exchange. These weren't the surface-level websites that occasional users might stumble upon. These were hidden corners of the internet, encrypted forums, invitation-only networks, places where predators gathered to share their crimes and fantasies with others who shared their sickness. Investigators had been building cases for months, using sophisticated digital forensics to track users, identify patterns, and create maps of who was connected to whom in these networks. They'd already arrested several individuals across different states, each case providing new leads, new usernames, new IP addresses to investigate. It was painstaking work, hours of analysis for every potential identification, countless dead ends for every breakthrough. Then they found Carlitos HMO. The username appeared in multiple forums, always active, always contributing new material. Whoever was behind this account wasn't just a consumer of child sexual abuse material. They were a producer, a creator, someone with ongoing access to children. The timestamps on the uploads suggested regular patterns, consistent timing. This wasn't someone taking advantage of occasional opportunities. This was someone whose lifestyle provided continuous access. A specialist analyzing the metadata from several images noticed something curious. The backgrounds were consistent. Same walls, same furniture arrangements, same stuffed animals visible in corners of frames. Whoever Carlitos HMO was, they were repeatedly accessing the same location. Even more telling, some images contained reflections in windows or mirrors that showed glimpses of a larger space. In one photograph, an investigator spotted part of a poster on a wall, colorful letters that seemed to be part of an alphabet chart. A daycare center, or a school, or some kind of childcare facility. The investigation intensified. They needed to geolocate this user to figure out where in Mexico Carlitos HMO was operating. The IP addresses were tricky, sometimes masked through VPNs, sometimes accessed through public Wi-Fi. But criminals make mistakes, and Christopher had made his months earlier when he'd accessed one of his forums from his home internet connection during a moment of carelessness. That single slip gave investigators what they needed: a location in Hermosillo, Sonora. Now they had a city with dozens of daycare centers, schools, after-school programs, and other childcare facilities. They needed more specificity, more evidence, more pieces to transform suspicion into actionable intelligence. They began the tedious process of cross-referencing registered childcare workers in Hermosillo with the online activity patterns of Carlitos HMO. They looked at the timing of posts. Did they align with typical childcare worker schedules? They analyzed the language used in forum posts. Did it suggest someone who worked professionally with children or just someone with criminal access? Everything pointed to a childcare professional. The investigators also noticed that Carlitos HMO had become increasingly active in recent months, sharing more content, engaging more frequently in discussions with other predators. This suggested growing confidence, escalating behavior. It also meant that children were currently at risk right now, being victimized by someone who believed himself untouchable. Time became critical. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, another arrested predator in a different state who, facing significant prison time, decided to cooperate with authorities. During his interrogation, when shown various usernames from the forums he'd participated in, he recognized Carlitos HMO. They chatted privately, traded material, even discussed their methods for avoiding detection. The arrested man remembered specific details from those conversations. That Carlitos HMO worked at a daycare in Sonora, that he'd been doing this for years, that he considered himself an expert in gaining parental trust. Armed with this information, investigators narrowed their focus to daycare centers in Hermosillo. They began surveillance, watching for male employees who fit the general profile, looking for patterns that might align with Carlitos HMO's online activity. They coordinated with local police, briefing them on the investigation while emphasizing the need for absolute discretion. They couldn't afford to spook their target. If Christopher suspected anything, he'd destroy evidence, perhaps disappear entirely. They watched, they waited, they gathered every scrap of evidence they could before making their move. And then, on an ordinary Thursday morning in late spring, they identified him with certainty. An investigator had been reviewing recent uploads from Carlitos HMO when she noticed something in the background of a video. A specific toy, a distinctive rocking horse painted with flowers. It was unusual enough that she thought it might be traceable. She spent hours researching that particular design, eventually discovering it was a custom piece created by a local artisan in Hermosillo who'd only made 3 of them. 2 had been sold to private families. 1 had been donated to a daycare center, the daycare center where Christopher Chavez Cuellar worked. Now they had probable cause. Now they could act. The arrest was planned with precision. They would execute the warrant early in the morning before the daycare opened, before children arrived, before Christopher could interact with another victim or destroy evidence. They assembled a team: federal agents, local police, digital forensic specialists, victim services coordinators. Everyone understood the gravity of what they were about to uncover. May 23, 2019, 6:45 in the morning. Christopher was at his apartment, probably preparing for another day of pretending to be T.O. Chris, when heavy fists pounded on his door. He opened it to find armed officers, badges raised, faces hard with the kind of disgust that comes from knowing exactly what someone has done. "Christopher Chavez Cuellar, you are under arrest." His face went pale. For 3 years he'd imagined himself invincible, but the look in these officers' eyes told him everything. They knew. They knew what he was. They knew what he'd done. His perfect disguise had been ripped away, and now he stood exposed for exactly what he'd always been: a monster. They searched his apartment while he sat handcuffed on his couch, watching his life collapse. Officers photographed everything, bagged evidence, secured his electronics. His phone, his laptop, his tablet, external hard drives he thought he'd hidden cleverly. They took it all. One officer emerged from a bedroom holding a box of children's toys, a collection Christopher had maintained to keep children comfortable when he convinced parents to let him babysit at his apartment. Another officer found folders of physical photographs, printouts Christopher had made of his favorites, images he could view without leaving digital traces. The apartment wasn't just a home. It was a crime scene. Every room contained evidence of his double life, the life where he was a predator who'd been systematically abusing children while everyone around him remained blissfully ignorant. During the search, Christopher said almost nothing. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand to know what this was about, didn't protest his innocence. He simply sat there, face blank, occasionally glancing at his phone sitting in an evidence bag on the table. That phone contained everything. He knew it. The officers knew it. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken horror. They transported him to a detention facility where he'd be held while forensic analysis was conducted on his devices. The preliminary examination alone revealed nightmares, thousands of images, hundreds of videos, detailed records of his victims, conversations with other predators discussing techniques and sharing materials. The forensic investigator who conducted the initial review had to take breaks, stepping outside to breathe fresh air and remind himself that he was doing this to protect children, to make sure Christopher Chavez Cuellar never touched another child again. The videos were particularly damning. Christopher had filmed himself committing assaults, often narrating what he was doing, sometimes directing children to move certain ways or perform specific actions. His voice, that same gentle voice that had comforted crying toddlers and read bedtime stories, was captured on these recordings, saying things so vile that transcribing them for evidence reports made seasoned prosecutors physically ill. One video showed him assaulting Valentina during nap time, the little girl clutching her stuffed rabbit while Christopher violated her, her face visible enough to show confusion and distress. Another showed a different child, a boy barely 3 years old, during what Christopher had told parents was extra tutoring time after regular hours. There were videos from his apartment, from the daycare, even from a park where he'd taken children on a field trip while another staff member was distracted. The evidence wasn't just abundant, it was overwhelming, undeniable, devastating. Investigators began the heartbreaking process of identifying victims. From the images and videos, they recognized children who'd attended the daycare. They cross-referenced enrollment records, matched faces to files, built timelines of when each child had been in Christopher's care. The list grew and grew and grew. At least 23 children could be definitively identified as victims. But investigators suspected there were more. Children who appeared in images at younger ages or from angles that made identification difficult. Children whose families had moved away. Children Christopher had accessed before working at this particular daycare. The true number might never be known. Now came the worst part, telling the parents. Police and victim services coordinators began making contact with families whose children had been identified in Christopher's collection. These conversations were agonizing for everyone involved. How do you tell a parent that the person they trusted, the person their child loved, had been systematically abusing that child? How do you explain that nap time wasn't nap time, that special activities weren't activities, that their instinct to trust had been weaponized against them and their children? One mother collapsed when she heard the news. Another father had to be physically restrained when he tried to leave immediately to confront Christopher at the detention facility. A grandmother who'd been caring for her grandson started screaming, a sound so primal and pain-filled that the officer delivering the news would hear it in her nightmares for years. These weren't just families learning about abuse. These were families having their entire reality shattered, learning that the past 3 years had been a lie, that their children had been suffering in ways they couldn't even fully comprehend. The daycare center closed immediately. Parents who hadn't yet been contacted by police arrived for morning drop-off to find crime scene tape and officers standing guard. Confusion turned to panic, turned to horror as word spread about what had happened. Parents clutched their children, searching small faces for signs of trauma they'd missed. Some children seemed normal, unaware of why mommy was crying. Others, the ones who appeared in Christopher's collection, already seemed different, quieter, more withdrawn in ways their parents had attributed to normal developmental phases. The community reeled. How had this happened? How had nobody noticed? How had Christopher Chavez Cuellar fooled everyone so completely? The answer was as disturbing as his crimes, because he'd understood exactly how to exploit human psychology. He'd known that trust, once established, creates blind spots. He'd known that people don't want to believe evil exists in familiar faces. He'd known that a society constantly warning about stranger danger had forgotten that monsters often wear friendly masks. And now, sitting in a cell while investigators continued documenting the full scope of his crimes, Christopher Chavez Cuellar had nowhere left to hide. The forensic examination of Christopher's electronic devices revealed a level of depravity and organization that shocked even veteran investigators who'd worked child exploitation cases for decades. This wasn't a collection acquired through downloading from others. This was a personally curated library of abuse, meticulously organized, constantly updated, representing years of systematic victimization. The primary device, his phone, contained over 14,000 images and videos. 14,000 individual files documenting his crimes against children whose only mistake had been being placed in his care. The phone's gallery was organized into folders with names that seemed innocent at first glance: Storytime, Naptime Helpers, Art Projects. But the contents were anything but innocent. Each folder represented a different category of abuse, different victims, different locations within the daycare or his apartment where he'd committed these acts. Digital forensic specialists worked around the clock, carefully documenting every file while also tracing metadata that would help establish timelines and verify authenticity. The metadata was damning. Dates, times, GPS coordinates all confirmed that these images had been created at the daycare center during operating hours, or at Christopher's apartment during times when parents had trusted him to babysit. The phone's calendar was synced with the daycare schedule, and investigators could cross-reference abuse incidents with specific days when Christopher had been working specific shifts. His laptop revealed even more disturbing depths. Beyond the images stored locally, investigators found his browsing history, thousands of visits to dark web forums where predators gathered to share materials and techniques. Christopher had been an active participant in multiple communities, using various usernames but always identifiable by his writing style and the distinctive content he shared. In these forums, Christopher hadn't just been a participant, he'd been a mentor to other predators. He'd written detailed posts about how to gain employment in childcare settings, how to pass background checks, how to build trust with parents and coworkers. He'd shared techniques for identifying vulnerable children, methods for conditioning victims into silence, strategies for creating blind spots in security camera coverage. He'd essentially written instruction manuals for other monsters, teaching them how to replicate his success in gaining access to children. One particularly chilling post, written just months before his arrest, read, "The key is patience. Don't rush. Spend 6 months, a year becoming indispensable. Make yourself the person everyone relies on. Once you have that position, you can do almost anything. Parents don't want to believe their trusted caregiver could be a threat. Use that denial. It's your greatest protection." Investigators found private messages where Christopher had traded material with other predators across the globe. He'd established a network of contacts in other countries, sharing files through encrypted platforms, using cryptocurrency for transactions when selling particularly sought-after content. Yes, Christopher hadn't just been abusing children for his own gratification. He'd been monetizing it, selling access to his victims, producing custom content based on requests from other predators willing to pay. Financial records seized during the investigation showed irregular deposits into Christopher's accounts, payments that couldn't be explained by his daycare salary. When pressed during interrogation, he initially claimed these were gifts from his family, but investigators traced the transactions back to cryptocurrency conversions, payments from overseas accounts, money earned through selling innocence to other monsters who consumed it from the safety of their own homes, their own countries, their own secret lives. One buyer, eventually identified as a businessman in Eastern Europe, had paid Christopher over $3,000 for a series of custom videos featuring a specific victim performing specific acts. Christopher had fulfilled this order during a week when that child's parents had asked him to provide after-hours care because they were dealing with a family emergency. While these parents scrambled to handle their crisis, grateful that trusted T.O. Chris could watch their daughter, Christopher was filming her abuse and selling it to a stranger thousands of miles away. The international scope of Christopher's network meant that his arrest triggered investigations in multiple countries. His contacts, his buyers, his fellow predators, law enforcement agencies around the world began coordinating efforts to identify and arrest everyone connected to Christopher's digital trail. Each arrested predator provided new leads, revealed new networks, exposed new victims. Christopher hadn't just destroyed the lives of children in Hermosillo, he'd contributed to a global industry of abuse that victimized thousands of children across continents. Investigators also discovered evidence that Christopher had been escalating. His earlier material, from his first year at the daycare, showed mostly clothed children in inappropriate positions, violations of trust and boundaries, but not yet involving physical contact. But the progression over time was clear. As his confidence grew, so did the severity of his crimes. By his third year, he was committing contact offenses, filming violent assaults, creating content that depicted children in extreme distress. Child psychologists consulted on the case explained that this escalation is common among child predators. The initial thrill diminishes, requiring more extreme acts to achieve the same satisfaction. Christopher's digital library documented this psychological trajectory, showing how his crimes became more frequent, more severe, more brazen over time. If he hadn't been caught when he was, experts believed he would have eventually killed a child, either deliberately or through injuries sustained during assault. The most disturbing aspect of Christopher's collection wasn't just what it contained, but how it was organized. He'd created detailed profiles for each victim, complete with photographs, personal information about their families, notes about their personalities and vulnerabilities. He documented which children were easiest to manipulate, which ones were most frightened, which ones had started showing behavioral changes that might alert their parents. This wasn't opportunistic abuse, this was systematic predation, conducted with the analytical precision of someone running a business. One folder on his laptop was titled Projects, and inside were partially edited videos that Christopher had been preparing for distribution. He'd added music, transitions, even text overlays with victim names and ages. He was producing professional quality content, treating child abuse like a commercial enterprise. Investigators found software for video editing, encryption programs for hiding files, tutorials he'd bookmarked about avoiding digital detection. Christopher had studied how to be a more effective predator the same way someone might study to be more effective at any job. His search history revealed obsessions that went beyond typical predatory behavior. He'd researched child development psychology, looking for information about what ages were least likely to report abuse accurately. He'd visited forums discussing legal loopholes and jurisdictional issues related to child exploitation laws. He'd read news articles about other arrested predators, analyzing where they'd made mistakes, learning from their failures to avoid making the same errors. In one text file buried in a hidden folder, investigators found what amounted to Christopher's manifesto, a long document where he'd written about his attraction to children, his belief that society was wrong to criminalize these desires, his conviction that he wasn't hurting children but rather introducing them to experiences they would supposedly understand better when older. The document was filled with the kind of cognitive distortions common among child predators. Rationalizations, justifications, reframing of violent abuse as somehow mutual or consensual despite victims being too young to even understand consent. Reading this document made investigators physically ill. It wasn't written by someone conflicted about his actions or struggling with compulsions. It was written by someone who'd fully embraced his identity as a predator, who felt entitled to access children's bodies, who viewed victims not as human beings but as objects for his gratification and profit. The forensic team also recovered deleted files, materials Christopher had tried to destroy before his arrest, but which could be retrieved through advanced data recovery techniques. These deleted files filled in gaps in the timeline, revealed additional victims, and provided evidence of Christopher's awareness that what he was doing was criminal. He'd deleted materials after close calls, after instances where a coworker had almost walked in on him, after a parent had asked questions that made him nervous. He knew he was committing crimes. He simply believed he was too clever to be caught. Among the recovered data was a draft resignation letter, never sent, dated approximately 6 months before his arrest. In it, Christopher had written about leaving the daycare to pursue other opportunities. Investigators believe he'd been planning to move to a different facility, possibly in a different city or even a different country, to start fresh with a new collection of victims. He'd been researching teaching positions in Southeast Asia, looking at countries with lax background check requirements and less developed child protection systems. If he'd followed through with this plan, he might have continued his crimes for years longer, victimizing children in communities that would have been even less equipped to identify and stop him. But he hadn't left. His arrogance and his addiction to the access he'd established in Hermosillo had kept him at the daycare center, working the same position where he'd committed hundreds of crimes, believing himself untouchable right up until the moment officers knocked on his door. The digital evidence wasn't just abundant, it was irrefutable. Defense attorneys would later acknowledge privately that Christopher's case was impossible to defend. The evidence was too clear, too extensive, too well documented. He'd created his own electronic death penalty, building a digital archive that would guarantee his conviction and ensure maximum sentencing. In total, investigators documented over 400 distinct criminal acts spread across the 14,000 files. Each identifiable instance of abuse, each video showing a separate assault, each image depicting a different child or a different day, all were cataloged, time-stamped, and prepared for prosecution. The evidence packets assembled for trial filled multiple storage drives and required special handling protocols because of the sensitive and disturbing nature of the materials. Some investigators who worked the case requested transfers afterward, unable to continue in child exploitation units after seeing the depths of depravity Christopher had documented. Others stayed, motivated by the knowledge that their work had stopped him, that the children he'd been abusing were now safe from him, that other children would be protected because he'd never walk free again. The digital evidence had captured everything Christopher had done, but it had also captured something else: the voices and faces of children being hurt, scared, confused. These weren't just legal exhibits. They were records of real trauma inflicted on real children. And every person who had to review this evidence as part of the investigation or prosecution carried the weight of witnessing that trauma. Christopher Chavez Cuellar had used technology to facilitate, document, and monetize his crimes. Now that same technology would be used to ensure his conviction and destroy any possibility of him ever claiming innocence. The digital trail he'd left was a roadmap directly to prison. The prosecution of Christopher Chavez Cuellar was swift by legal standards, though agonizingly slow for the families waiting for justice. The evidence was so overwhelming that there was never any real question about guilt. The only questions were about charges, sentencing, and how to handle the needs of so many young victims. Christopher was charged with multiple counts across several categories: production and distribution of child sexual abuse material, sexual assault of minors, corruption of minors, exploitation of children, and trafficking-related offenses connected to his selling of materials. Each identified victim represented multiple charges. The indictment eventually contained over 100 separate counts, though prosecutors knew they didn't need all of them to secure a life sentence. His defense attorneys faced an impossible situation. The evidence was incontrovertible. Christopher had documented his own crimes in such detail that denial was pointless. Early in the process, his lawyers approached prosecutors about a plea agreement. Christopher would plead guilty to all charges in exchange for the prosecution's recommendation of concurrent sentencing rather than consecutive, meaning his multiple sentences would run simultaneously instead of one after another. Without this agreement, Christopher faced potentially 300 years in prison if all sentences ran consecutively. With the agreement, he'd serve 60 years without possibility of parole. 60 years. For a 29-year-old man, this was still effectively a life sentence. He'd be 89 years old if he somehow survived to his release date, an old man who'd spent his entire adult life and all of his middle age behind bars. The prosecution accepted the plea primarily to spare victims from having to testify. Putting young children on the stand, forcing them to recount their abuse in open court while Christopher watched, would have compounded their trauma. The video evidence was sufficient for conviction. The children didn't need to relive their worst experiences to ensure justice was served. The plea hearing took place on a gray morning in October, 7 months after Christopher's arrest. The courtroom was packed with parents, victims' advocates, police officers who'd worked the case, and members of the community who'd followed the story with a mixture of horror and rage. Christopher sat at the defense table wearing prison orange, looking smaller somehow than he had in his daycare worker clothes, diminished without the costume of normalcy he'd worn for so long. When the judge asked how he pleaded to each count, Christopher responded in a monotone, "Guilty." 100 times he said that word. 100 admissions of guilt. 100 confirmations that yes, he'd done these things, he'd hurt these children, he'd destroyed these families. The victim impact statements were devastating. Parents were given the opportunity to address Christopher and the court, to speak about what his crimes had cost their families. Not all chose to participate. Some couldn't bear to be in the same room with him, but those who did speak painted a portrait of shattered innocence and long-term damage that would echo through generations. One mother described how her daughter, once a happy and outgoing child, now screamed during bath times, refused to be alone with any adult men, including her own grandfather, and woke from nightmares crying for hours. The little girl was 6 years old and already in intensive therapy, trying to process trauma that most adults couldn't comprehend. Her mother addressed Christopher directly. "You stole her childhood. You stole our family's peace. We trusted you, and you turned that trust into a weapon. There is no punishment severe enough for what you've done." A father spoke about his son, who'd stopped speaking for 3 months after Christopher's arrest. The boy had been so confused about why T.O. Chris wasn't at school anymore, why everyone was suddenly asking him questions about their time together, why his parents kept crying. When he finally told them what Christopher had done to him, describing it in simple language because he didn't have better words for it, his father had excused himself to vomit in the courthouse bathroom. Now his son, at age 5, knew words and concepts that no 5-year-old should ever need to know. That father told the court, "My son asked me last week if he'd done something wrong, if it was his fault that T.O. Chris got in trouble." A 5-year-old child blaming himself for being abused. That's what this man has done. Impact statements came from grandparents who'd trusted Christopher when picking up their grandchildren, from older siblings who felt guilty for not protecting their younger brothers and sisters, from teachers at other schools who were now trying to help these children rebuild their ability to trust adults. Each statement added another layer to the portrait of destruction Christopher had wrought. Not just individual trauma, but community-wide devastation that would take years, perhaps decades, to fully heal. The judge listened to every statement, her face growing harder with each one. When it came time for sentencing, she looked directly at Christopher and spoke with barely contained fury. "Mr. Chavez Cuellar, you systematically betrayed the trust of an entire community. You weaponized your position as a caregiver to gain access to the most vulnerable members of our society. You didn't just abuse these children. You documented their abuse, you sold their suffering, you profited from their pain. You treated innocence as a commodity. The harm you have caused is immeasurable and irreversible. These children will carry the scars of your actions for the rest of their lives. Their families will never fully recover from the betrayal you represent. I accept your guilty plea, and I sentence you to 60 years in prison without the possibility of parole. You will be registered as a sex offender for life. Upon release, should you live that long, you will be subject to lifetime monitoring and will be prohibited from any contact with minors. You will never work with children again. You will never be trusted again. And you will spend the majority of your remaining years contemplating the magnitude of your crimes." Christopher showed no emotion during the sentencing. No tears, no remorse, no reaction beyond a slight nod when the judge finished speaking. Some observers interpreted this as sociopathy, a complete absence of empathy or guilt. Others wondered if he was simply numb, his brain unable to process the reality of what was happening. Either way, his blank expression provided no comfort to the families watching. They wanted to see remorse, acknowledgement, some sign that he understood what he'd done. Instead, they got nothing. He was immediately transported to a maximum security facility where he'd begin serving his sentence. Word of his crimes had preceded him, and prison justice has its own code. Child predators occupy the lowest rung in prison hierarchies, despised even by murderers and violent criminals who draw ethical lines at harming children. Christopher would spend much of his incarceration in protective custody, separated from the general population for his own safety. Even in prison, he'd be isolated, alone with his thoughts and his crimes. But the legal proceedings weren't entirely finished. The international investigation Christopher's arrest had triggered continued expanding. Over the following year, law enforcement agencies across 12 countries arrested 47 individuals connected to the predator networks Christopher had participated in. His digital contacts, the people he'd sold materials to, the fellow predators he'd mentored, investigators tracked them down one by one. Each arrest led to more victims being identified, more children being removed from dangerous situations, more predators being taken off the streets. Christopher's conviction became a domino, triggering a cascade of justice that extended far beyond Hermosillo. In an odd way, his compulsive documentation of everything, which had seemed like his greatest strength, had become the weapon that brought down an entire network. He'd kept records of his contacts, maintained conversation logs, preserved transaction histories. All of that information, which he believed was safely encrypted and hidden, became evidence that destroyed dozens of other predators. In Hermosillo, the daycare center where Christopher had worked never reopened. The building stood empty for months, a physical reminder of the horrors that had unfolded within its cheerfully painted walls. Parents couldn't imagine sending their children there again, even if Christopher was gone. Eventually, the property was sold and converted into a small medical clinic, a deliberate choice to transform the space into something that helped rather than harmed the community. The families of Christopher's victims faced long roads to recovery. Child psychologists specializing in sexual abuse trauma worked with each victim, using age-appropriate therapy techniques to help them process what had happened. Some children were too young to fully understand yet, their abuse manifesting as behavioral changes, attachment difficulties, and developmental regression that would require years of support. Older victims, those who could articulate what had been done to them, struggled with shame, confusion, and anger that therapy could help manage but never completely erase. Parents dealt with their own trauma, guilt over not recognizing the signs, rage at Christopher for his betrayal, fear about their children's futures. Support groups formed, bringing together families who shared this terrible experience. In these groups, parents could speak openly about their feelings without judgment, could learn from each other's coping strategies, could simply not be alone with their grief and fury. One mother became an advocate for stronger oversight of childcare facilities. She lobbied local government for mandatory camera systems with no blind spots, stricter ratio requirements for adult supervision, and more comprehensive background checks that included social media and online activity monitoring. Her advocacy led to new regulations implemented across Sonora, changes that might prevent another predator from exploiting the kind of access Christopher had enjoyed. A father channeled his anger into education, creating presentations about warning signs of child sexual abuse that he delivered to parent groups, schools, and community organizations throughout the region. He couldn't undo what had happened to his son, but he could help other parents learn to watch for red flags, to trust their instincts when something felt wrong, to understand that predators often look nothing like the strangers they've been taught to fear. The community's collective trauma manifested in various ways. Trust became a casualty. Parents who'd once chatted casually during pickup times now eyed other caregivers with suspicion. Male daycare workers throughout the city found themselves under increased scrutiny, facing unfair assumptions because Christopher had poisoned the well of trust. Background checks became more common, parents asked more questions, and the casual delegation of childcare responsibilities that had once been normal became fraught with anxiety. Some critics argued this represented an overreaction, that not every childcare worker was a predator, that fear shouldn't dominate the relationship between parents and caregivers. But parents who trusted Christopher couldn't unhear the words "T.O. Chris" spoken in their children's nightmares. They couldn't unsee their children's faces when explaining why that nice man wouldn't be at school anymore. Overreaction to them seemed impossible. If anything, they'd underreacted before, been too trusting, too willing to believe that evil couldn't wear such a friendly face. The investigation also revealed institutional failures that had enabled Christopher's crimes. The daycare center had policies requiring 2 adults present during certain activities, but these policies hadn't been consistently enforced. Background checks had been conducted when Christopher was hired, but there'd been no periodic rescreening. Security cameras existed but had notable blind spots that Christopher had exploited, and nobody had thought to question why he seemed so interested in furniture arrangements that just happened to block camera views. These failures didn't excuse Christopher's crimes. He alone bore responsibility for his actions, but they highlighted systemic vulnerabilities that needed addressing. The state conducted audits of childcare facilities throughout Sonora, identifying and requiring corrections for security gaps, policy violations, and oversight failures. Licensing requirements were strengthened. Inspection procedures were enhanced. None of this would help Christopher's victims, but it might protect future children. Media coverage of the case was extensive, both nationally and internationally. News outlets struggled with how to report on such disturbing crimes without sensationalizing them or inadvertently identifying victims. Some coverage was responsible, focusing on the legal proceedings and systemic issues. Other coverage was exploitative, dwelling on lurid details in ways that served no purpose beyond attracting viewers. The families learned to avoid reading news coverage entirely, unable to see their worst experiences reduced to headlines and sound bites. Years would pass before the full scope of Christopher's damage could be assessed. Some victims would eventually recover enough to lead relatively normal lives, their trauma managed through therapy and family support. Others would struggle with lasting effects, difficulty forming relationships, challenges with intimacy and trust, psychological conditions like PTSD and depression that would require ongoing treatment. Studies of child sexual abuse victims show that trauma experienced at young ages can affect brain development, alter stress response systems, and create vulnerabilities that persist into adulthood. Christopher hadn't just hurt these children. He'd potentially altered the trajectory of their entire lives, affecting everything from their future relationships to their career choices to their ability to parent their own children someday. Some victims' families relocated, moving to different cities or even different states to escape the reminders and the community's knowledge of what had happened. Starting over somewhere new, where their children weren't known as one of Christopher's victims, offered a kind of anonymity that felt necessary for healing. Other families stayed, determined not to be driven from their homes by what Christopher had done, refusing to let him take anything more from them than he already had. The case prompted broader conversations about child safety in Mexico and internationally. Organizations working to combat child sexual exploitation used Christopher's case as an example in training materials, showing how predators gain access and maintain that access through manipulation and trust building. The case became a teaching tool, a cautionary tale, a rallying cry for better protection of children. In prison, Christopher settled into his new reality. Reports from corrections officers described him as quiet, compliant, spending most of his time alone. He received no visitors. His family had disowned him immediately after his arrest, unable to reconcile the man they'd known with the monster he'd been revealed to be. He had no friends, no support system, no one who cared whether he lived or died behind those walls. Some might argue this isolation was its own form of justice, a daily punishment that would last decades. Others felt no amount of suffering could balance the scales against what he'd done to innocent children. There was no punishment severe enough, no sentence long enough, no suffering adequate to match the harm he'd caused. 60 years in prison. 60 years of knowing that everyone who knew what he'd done despised him. 60 years of being exactly what he'd spent 3 years pretending not to be. A monster, exposed and caged. But those 60 years were his sentence. The children he'd abused received life sentences of a different kind. Trauma they'd carry forever. Innocence they could never reclaim. Trust that would take lifetimes to rebuild if it ever fully returned. The case of Christopher Chavez Cuellar serves as a dark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives with a warm smile and a gentle voice, with references and certifications, with a reputation for kindness and a way with children. Sometimes the devil wears a daycare worker's uniform and answers to Tio Chris. And sometimes, despite all our efforts to protect our children, despite all our warnings about strangers, the greatest danger comes from the people we've been taught to trust. The families continue healing. The children continue growing. Christopher continues serving his sentence. Justice, imperfect as it is, has been served. But the scars remain, and they always will, because some betrayals are so profound, so completely devastating, that recovery isn't about forgetting or forgiving. It's about learning to carry the weight of what happened without being crushed by it. That's the true aftermath of Christopher Chavez Cuellar's crimes. Not just his imprisonment, but the lifetime of healing his victims must now undertake. Not just justice served, but innocence stolen. Not just a monster caged, but childhood destroyed. And in the end, no amount of time behind bars can restore what was taken. No punishment can give back what was lost. No sentence can undo what was done. That's the tragedy beyond the crime, that justice, when it finally comes, can never truly make things right. It can only ensure that the monster who shattered so many lives will never have the chance to destroy another. If you're new here, welcome to the channel. where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2, the Emilson Rojas case. Some doors should never be opened because what crawls out doesn't crawl back in. They say evil wears many faces, but in this case, it wore a smile until the very last second. Tonight, we're chasing shadows through blood-soaked corridors where a young woman's laughter turned to silence, and the person who made her disappear wasn't a stranger lurking in darkness. They were hiding in plain sight, wearing trust like a mask. This is the story of Emilson Rojas, a life extinguished by hands that once promised protection, and a horror so intimate, so calculated, that it turned a home into a tomb. What you're about to hear will slither under your skin and stay there, whispering the oldest truth humanity refuses to accept. The real monsters don't break down your door. They're already inside. February 17th, 2013. Barranquilla, Colombia. The air hung thick with Caribbean humidity, the kind that clings to your throat and makes every breath feel borrowed. Somewhere in the maze of concrete homes and narrow streets, a 23-year-old woman named Emilson Rojas was living her last hours, though she didn't know it yet. She couldn't have known that the walls around her, walls that should have meant safety, were closing in like a vice. Emilson wasn't supposed to be memorable in the way she became memorable. She was studying, working, dreaming of futures that stretched beyond the limitations of her neighborhood. Dark-haired, bright-eyed, with a smile that her family would later describe as infectious. The kind that made strangers feel like old friends. She had plans, ambitions, a boyfriend who loved her, a family who adored her. She had everything that makes a life worth living, and absolutely nothing that suggested her name would soon be whispered in horror across a nation. But evil doesn't announce itself with sirens and warnings. Creeps. It waits. It studies its prey with the patience of a spider in its web. And when it strikes with precision. The day Emilson disappeared, the sun rose the same way it always did, indifferent, merciless, casting long shadows that seemed to point accusingly at doors that should have stayed locked. Her family noticed her absence first, the way families do when a heartbeat suddenly stops echoing through the house. A chair left empty at breakfast. A phone that rings and rings into the void. The subtle wrongness that precedes every nightmare before the screaming starts. They called. They searched. They knocked on doors and asked questions that nobody wanted to answer. Have you seen Emilson? The words became a mantra, a prayer spoken into darkness that swallowed it whole and gave nothing back. Days crawled by like wounded animals, each one heavier than the last. The police were notified. Reports were filed. Photographs were circulated. A young woman's face stared out from missing person posters, her eyes asking a question nobody could answer. Where am I? But here's where the story twists into something fouler, something that makes your stomach clench and your instincts scream. While the family searched, while the community rallied, while the city's underbelly was turned over looking for answers, the truth was hiding somewhere so obvious, so horrifically close, that when it finally emerged, it didn't just shock people. It broke them. Emilson had been staying with her aunt, Leticia Rojas, in a modest home that should have been sanctuary. Family is supposed to be the fortress against the world's cruelty, the place where you let your guard down because you believe you need to believe that blood protects blood. But in that house, something had gone catastrophically wrong. Something had festered in the darkness behind closed doors, rotting the foundation of trust until it collapsed entirely. Leticia's husband, a man named Omar Jose Rayo Martinez, had been there too. He was 44 years old, a figure who moved through the household with the kind of authority that comes from being the man of the house, the provider, the protector. Except he wasn't any of those things. He was something else entirely, something that had learned to mimic humanity while nurturing appetites that belonged to darker, older things. The search for Emilson intensified as days became weeks. Volunteers combed through vacant lots and abandoned buildings. Divers plunged into murky waters. Search dogs followed scent trails that evaporated into nothing. The city held its breath, waiting for the phone call that never seemed to come. The one that would say she'd been found alive, confused but unharmed, ready to come home. But that call wasn't coming. It was never coming, because while everyone searched the streets, the answer was rotting in the walls. The human mind struggles with certain concepts. We build elaborate defense mechanisms to protect ourselves from truths too terrible to process. We tell ourselves stories. That couldn't happen here. Not to us. Not to people we know. We need these lies like we need oxygen because the alternative, accepting that horror lives in the ordinary, that predators wear familiar faces, that safety is an illusion we paint over chaos, that alternative is unbearable. Omar Jose Rayo Martinez understood this. He counted on it. While Emilson's mother wept and her siblings posted desperate pleas on social media, while strangers organized search parties and the news media amplified her disappearance, Omar went to work. He came home. He ate dinner. He maintained the facade of concern, of bewilderment, of a man equally mystified by this tragic vanishing. He was a masterclass in deception, a performance so convincing that even people trained to spot lies were fooled. But lies, no matter how carefully constructed, have a shelf life. Truth has weight, literal, physical weight, and eventually that weight becomes impossible to hide. The house began to smell. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, insidiously. A putrid sweetness started seeping through the floorboards and clinging to the curtains. Neighbors noticed. They wrinkled their noses and made casual comments about rats dying in the walls, about the sewage system backing up, about anything except the possibility that the smell was human. Letitia noticed too. How could she not? The stench was becoming undeniable, filling the house with an invisible fog of decay that no amount of cleaning products could mask. But here's where the story fractures into even darker territory. What did she think was happening? What explanations did her mind manufacture to avoid the unthinkable? Or did she know? Did she lie awake at night, her husband breathing beside her, and feel the horrible truth pressing down on her chest like a stone? The human capacity for denial is vast, almost infinite. We can convince ourselves of almost anything if the alternative means accepting that we're sleeping next to a monster, that we've been eating breakfast with someone who did the unthinkable, that our normal life is built on a foundation of horror. The mind rebels against such revelations. It fractures. It rewrites history. It does whatever necessary to maintain the illusion of sanity. But reality, patient and relentless, was closing in. The smell grew worse. The questions grew louder. The police, following tips and instinct, began to focus their investigation on the last place Emilson had been seen, her aunt's home. They started asking uncomfortable questions, the kind that strip away pretense and expose the raw truth beneath. They watched Omar's body language, studied his responses, noticed the micro-expressions that leak through even the best rehearsed lies. And Omar, feeling the net tightening, made his move. March 2013, a month after Emilson vanished into the house and never emerged. Omar Jose Rayo Martinez did what cornered predators have done since the beginning of time. He ran. He abandoned the house, the wife, the life he'd constructed, and disappeared into the anonymous sprawl of the city. His departure was an admission of guilt louder than any confession. You don't run from ghosts. You don't flee from bad luck or coincidence. You run from consequences. You run from the thing you've done. His absence created a vacuum that the police immediately filled. They descended on the house with search warrants and cadaver dogs, with ground-penetrating radar and grim determination. They weren't looking for Emilson anymore, not the living, breathing version. They were looking for what remained, for evidence, for the truth that had been rotting behind walls while everyone searched in the wrong places. The dogs went insane. They barked and whined and scratched at specific spots with frantic urgency, their training overridden by instinct, by the undeniable recognition of death. The investigators followed their lead, tearing into walls and floors with tools that rang out like funeral bells. Each impact echoed through the neighborhood, drawing crowds of horrified spectators who pressed against police barriers, needing to see but terrified of what they might witness. And then, in a moment that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives, they found her. Not whole, not recognizable, not anything that resembled the smiling girl from the missing person posters. What they found was what remains when life is stolen and hidden away, when a human being is reduced to evidence in a crime scene, to something that has to be carefully excavated and documented and pieced back together by forensic specialists who've trained themselves not to think about who this used to be. Emilson Rojas had never left the house. She'd been there all along, sealed behind walls while her family searched the streets, present at her own vigils, listening to her mother's prayers through layers of plaster and paint. The horror of this realization rippled outward like a shockwave, shattering the community's sense of safety and leaving questions that would never be fully answered. How long had she suffered? What were her last thoughts? Did she call for help that went unanswered? Did she understand what was happening? Or did death come as a mercy, swift and unexpected? These are the questions that torture the living, the ones that turn grief into something sharper, more destructive. These are the questions that transform victims into ghosts that haunt not houses but hearts. The house was now a crime scene, wrapped in yellow tape that fluttered in the Caribbean breeze like warning flags. Forensic teams worked methodically, cataloging every fiber and fluid, building a case from the evidence that Omar had been too arrogant or too panicked to fully destroy. Because that's the thing about murder, it's messy. It's impossible to completely erase. Blood seeps into wood grain. DNA clings to surfaces. The body itself becomes a witness, telling stories in bruises and broken bones and the chemistry of decomposition. Omar Jose Rayo Martinez was running, but he wasn't free. Freedom requires innocence, or at least the ability to forget what you've done, and Omar carried his crime like a second skin, impossible to shed. Somewhere in the urban sprawl of Colombia, he was hiding, but hiding requires resources and planning and the kind of cool rationality that abandons people when their world implodes. He'd left behind his life, his wife, his facade of normalcy. All he had now was the knowledge of what he'd done and the increasingly desperate hope that he could outrun consequences indefinitely. He couldn't. The manhunt for Omar intensified with every passing hour. His face appeared on news broadcasts and social media, those digital wanted posters that turn entire populations into an army of eyes. Someone always knows someone. Someone always sees something. In the modern age, disappearing completely requires more than just leaving town. It requires becoming invisible in a world obsessed with seeing everything, and Omar didn't have those skills. He was a predator, yes, but a clumsy one. Arrogant, careless. The kind who believed he was smarter than everyone else right up until the moment the handcuffs clicked shut. The police tracked him through a combination of old-fashioned detective work and modern technology. They followed financial transactions, traced phone calls, interviewed associates who claimed they never suspected and couldn't believe he was capable of such horror. This is the chorus that follows every monster's capture. The shocked denial of those who stood closest, who should have seen but chose blindness, who preferred comfortable ignorance to uncomfortable truth. Friends described Omar as quiet, respectful, hardworking. Neighbors called him pleasant, unremarkable, the kind of man who blended into the background of daily life. This is the terrifying banality of evil, that it doesn't announce itself with gothic theatrics and sinister music. It wears ordinary clothes and speaks in ordinary tones and passes you in the supermarket without triggering any alarms. The monsters of real life don't look like monsters. They look like us. They are us, separated only by choices made in moments when darkness whispers and something inside says yes. What drives a man to kill? Criminologists and psychologists have spent centuries trying to answer this question, building elaborate theories about nature and nurture, about brain chemistry and childhood trauma, about the complex web of factors that transform a human being into something monstrous. But sometimes the answer is simpler and more disturbing. Desire. Not love or passion or any of the emotions we romanticize. Just desire, raw, selfish, consuming, coupled with the fundamental belief that what you want matters more than someone else's right to exist. Evidence suggests that Omar had developed an obsession with Emilson, his young niece by marriage, living under his roof, vulnerable and trusting. The relationship between predator and prey always involves proximity and access, a horrible intimacy that betrays every principle of protection and care. He would have watched her, studied her patterns, noticed when she was alone, when others weren't paying attention, when opportunity aligned with his twisted impulses. What happened in those final moments? The forensic evidence would eventually tell part of the story, the brutal, clinical part written in injuries and defensive wounds. Emilson fought. She fought hard. Her body bore the marks of someone who understood that death was coming and refused to accept it without struggle. Nails broken, skin beneath her fingernails, his skin, his DNA, the proof that would help seal his fate. Bruises that mapped the progression of violence, the escalation from assault to murder. But forensics can't capture the terror. They can't quantify the moment when hope dies and acceptance sets in. They can't measure the betrayal that this person, this family member who should have been protector, was instead the predator. The worst violations always come from those who were supposed to keep us safe. That's why we remember these crimes so vividly, why they burrow into our collective consciousness and nest there. They attack the foundations of trust that civilization requires to function. Omar had killed her in that house, in her aunt's house. Had Letitia been home? Had she heard sounds from another room and convinced herself they were something innocent? Had she been complicit, or was she another victim of Omar's manipulations? A woman who discovered too late what kind of man she'd married? These questions would fuel speculation and judgment, armchair investigators dissecting every detail and arguing about guilt and complicity in comment sections and crime forums. After the murder, Omar faced a choice that reveals the calculating nature of his evil. He could have fled immediately, abandoning everything in a panic. He could have called the police, confessed, faced consequences. He could have done a dozen different things. Instead, he chose concealment. He chose to hide Emilson's body within the very walls of the home, to seal her away and continue living there, sleeping there, eating there, with her remains decomposing mere feet away. This requires a particular kind of sociopathy. Not the Hollywood version with the charming smiles and brilliant minds. The real kind, the absence of empathy so complete that another person's death registers as nothing more than a problem to be solved, a mess to be cleaned, an obstacle to be hidden. Omar looked at Emilson's body and felt no remorse, no horror, no human connection. He felt only the need to avoid consequences, and he acted accordingly. The process of concealing her would have taken time. Hours probably, maybe longer. He would have had to source materials, cement, tools, whatever was necessary to create a tomb within a wall. He would have had to physically handle her body, move it, position it, cover it. Each of these actions requires touching death, feeling the weight of it, confronting the reality of what's been done. Most people couldn't do it. The horror would break them, force confession, drive them to anything that would end the nightmare. But Omar wasn't most people. He was something else, something that could complete these tasks methodically while already planning how to deflect suspicion, how to play the concerned relative when questions inevitably came. When police finally tracked Omar down, the arrest was anticlimactic in the way that reality often disappoints our narrative expectations. There was no dramatic standoff, no philosophical exchange between detective and criminal. Just a man being handcuffed and read his rights, his face betraying nothing. Not remorse, not fear, not the relief that confession sometimes brings. Just emptiness. The same emptiness that had allowed him to kill in the first place. In custody, Omar initially maintained his innocence with the kind of defiance that suggests he believed he could still manipulate his way free. He claimed he knew nothing about Emilson's disappearance, suggested she'd run away, implied she had secrets, problems, reasons to vanish that had nothing to do with him. This is standard predator behavior, attacking the victim's credibility, seeding doubt, trying to shift focus anywhere but toward the truth. But the evidence was overwhelming. The forensics were damning. His own actions, the flight, the concealment, the lies, had built an unassailable case against him. As the investigation deepened, more details emerged that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Omar had a history, not of murder necessarily, but of behavior that suggested violence simmering beneath a calm surface. Previous relationships marked by control and intimidation. Allegations that had been dismissed or ignored. The pattern that always becomes obvious in hindsight when we look back with knowledge of what someone is capable of and wonder how we missed the warning signs. But we miss them because we want to, because acknowledging that danger lives among us, that we can't always tell predator from protector, that safety is a comforting myth. This is psychologically intolerable. So we explain away the red flags. We give people the benefit of the doubt. We tell ourselves that things aren't as bad as they seem, that we're overreacting, that surely there's a reasonable explanation. And sometimes there is. But sometimes there isn't, and by the time we realize our mistake, someone is already dead. Letitia found herself in an impossible position. Her husband had murdered her niece, in her home, under her roof. How does someone process that information? How does the brain integrate such contradictory realities? The man you loved enough to marry and the monster who destroyed family. She would have to testify, would have to recount details, would have to face both the prosecution asking her what she knew and when she knew it, and the defense trying to implicate her, to suggest she was complicit or should have known or could have prevented what happened. The public turned on her with predictable ferocity. People who'd never met her, who knew nothing about her life or marriage, felt entitled to judge. They called her complicit, blind, guilty by association. They demanded to know how she couldn't have known what was happening in her own home, as if evil announces itself clearly, as if monsters are always obvious. The truth that abusers are often master manipulators, that people can live double lives with terrifying skill, that sometimes the person sleeping beside you is a stranger. This truth doesn't satisfy our need for the world to make sense. We want clear villains and innocent victims, neat categories that protect us from the chaos of reality. The investigation uncovered the specific sequence of events with the grim precision that forensic science enables. Emilson had been killed shortly after she'd last been seen alive. The cause of death would be debated and analyzed by experts who would testify in clinical terms about injuries and mechanisms, translating human suffering into medical terminology. Omar had used force, significant force. This wasn't accidental or impulsive in the heat of an argument. This was sustained violence, an intentional ending of life. After death, he'd moved her body. The logistics of this alone are nightmarish. The physical reality of handling the dead, the weight and unwieldiness of it, the undeniable fact of what he was doing. He'd selected a location within the house. Had he chosen it beforehand, or was it improvised panic? Had he planned this murder, or had something triggered him? These questions matter for prosecution and sentencing, but they don't change the fundamental reality. A young woman was dead, and the man responsible had tried to make her disappear while pretending to be mystified by her absence. The walls that concealed Emilson became a metaphor that the media couldn't resist. Headlines screamed about horror hidden in plain sight and the House of Secrets. Crime shows would later dramatize the case, actors playing Emilson and Omar in reenactments that could never capture the real horror because horror isn't entertainment. It's the feeling that safety is impossible, that monsters are real, that the world is fundamentally unsafe in ways we desperately need to deny. The Colombian justice system prepared to confront Omar Jose Rayo Martinez with the weight of his crimes. Trials in murder cases are strange theatrical productions where horror is presented through testimony and exhibits, where grief is channeled into legal arguments, where the messy reality of human death is organized into evidence logs and witness statements. The courtroom becomes a stage where society performs its response to evil, where we demonstrate that laws matter and consequences exist and civilization has mechanisms to address the worst things people do to each other. But justice is cold comfort. No verdict resurrects the dead. No sentence undoes trauma or returns stolen futures. The trial exists not for the victim. Emilson was beyond caring about legal proceedings, but for the living. For her family, who needed to see Omar face consequences. For society, which needed reassurance that order could be restored, that monsters could be caught and caged. For all of us watching from a distance, who needed to believe that what happened to Emilson was aberration, not pattern, that we could identify the factors that led to her death and protect ourselves from similar fates. Omar arrived in court surrounded by guards, his hands bound, his expression carefully neutral. Defendants in murder trials often adopt this mask, neither defiant nor remorseful, just blank. Lawyers coach them on this. Show no emotion. Don't give the prosecution anything to use. Don't give the media sound bites or the jury reasons to hate you more than they already do. So Omar sat silent and expressionless while prosecutors built their case, brick by evidentiary brick, constructing a narrative that would seal his fate. The prosecution's strategy was straightforward because the evidence was overwhelming. They didn't need elaborate theories or circumstantial reasoning. They had forensics. They had his flight from justice. They had the body. Emilson herself bearing witness from beyond death, her remains telling stories of violence and concealment. The prosecutors walked the jury through the timeline, establishing opportunity and motive and means. They brought in experts who testified about DNA and decomposition, about how long a body had been sealed in that wall, about the injuries that ended Emilson's life. Her family attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row where Omar couldn't avoid seeing them. This is part of the process too, a reminder that victims aren't abstractions but real people with relatives who love them, whose absence creates permanent holes in the fabric of families. Emilson's mother aged decades and months, her face carved with grief too profound for tears. Her siblings sat rigid with anger, staring at Omar with hatred that could have ignited paper. This is what murder does. It doesn't just destroy the victim but detonates in the lives of everyone connected, spreading damage in ever-widening circles. The defense had an impossible job. How do you defend someone when the evidence is this clear, when your client fled from police and the victim was found in his home, sealed in walls? They couldn't claim innocence, no jury would believe it. So they tried mitigation instead, attempting to construct a narrative that made Omar seem less monstrous, more human, someone who'd made a terrible mistake rather than a calculated predator. They talked about his childhood, his struggles, his mental state. They brought in experts who discussed impulse control and emotional regulation and the complicated factors that contribute to violence. But the jury wasn't buying it. You could see it in their faces, the way they looked at Omar not with understanding but with disgust. Because sometimes people don't want nuanced psychological explanations. Sometimes they want clear lines between good and evil, between us and them. Sometimes they need to believe that people who do monstrous things are monsters, fundamentally different from normal humans, marked by some essential corruption that makes them identifiable, containable, different from us. The trial became a media sensation, one of those cases that captures public attention and won't let go. News channels provided gavel-to-gavel coverage. True crime bloggers dissected every detail. Social media erupted with opinions from people who'd never been to Colombia, never known Emilson, but felt entitled to weigh in on every aspect of the case. This is the modern spectacle of tragedy. Everyone gets to participate, to feel something, to share their outrage and grief with strangers who affirm their emotions and amplify their voices. But beneath the media circus, something more fundamental was happening. The trial was establishing truth in an official, legal sense. This matters more than people sometimes understand. Without trials, without evidence presented and tested and judged, we're left with rumors and speculation, with competing narratives and conspiracy theories. The trial creates a record that says, this is what happened. These are the facts. This person did this terrible thing and here is the proof. This record becomes historical truth, the version that survives in official documents and legal precedents and collective memory. Witness testimony added human dimension to the forensic evidence. People who'd known Emilson spoke about her warmth, her dreams, the future that would never arrive. They described the last times they'd seen her, ordinary moments that gained tragic weight in retrospect. The last conversation, the last laugh, the last goodbye. These testimonies weren't strictly necessary for conviction. The physical evidence was sufficient, but they served another purpose. They reminded everyone that this case wasn't just about legal procedures and criminal codes. It was about a real person whose real life had been violently ended. The defense tried to poke holes in the prosecution's timeline to suggest that perhaps things weren't as clear as they seemed. But modern forensic science doesn't leave much room for reasonable doubt when applied correctly. The evidence formed a web that caught Omar completely, no gaps large enough to escape through. DNA linked him to the crime. The concealment proved consciousness of guilt. His flight confirmed he knew exactly what he'd done and understood the consequences. Perhaps the most damning evidence was Omar's own behavior in the days and weeks after Emilson's disappearance. Prosecutors presented testimony from people who'd interacted with him during that period, who'd asked if he'd seen Emilson or knew where she might be. He'd lied smoothly, convincingly, expressing appropriate concern while knowing exactly where she was, decomposing behind the wall while he went about his daily routines. This cold-blooded deception, this ability to maintain normalcy while hiding such horror, revealed a level of sociopathy that made him seem less human, more like something wearing human form. The prosecution built toward their closing argument with the confidence of lawyers who know they've already won. They recapped the evidence, walking the jury through it one final time, making sure every piece connected, every question answered. Then they talked about Emilson, not as evidence or victim but as a person, a young woman with plans and hopes and people who loved her. They described what her last moments must have been like, the terror and betrayal and pain. They didn't have to exaggerate or invent. The facts were horrible enough. The defense's closing argument was more restrained, almost perfunctory. They asked for mercy, for consideration of mitigating factors, for a recognition that sending someone to prison forever is a serious decision that should be made carefully. But their hearts weren't in it. How could they be? They were doing their job, fulfilling their professional obligation to provide vigorous defense, but everyone in that courtroom, including the defense attorneys themselves, knew that Omar was guilty and deserved whatever punishment the law allowed. The jury deliberated for less than a day. In murder cases with overwhelming evidence, long deliberations suggest doubt or disagreement. Short ones indicate that the verdict was obvious, that the evidence left no reasonable path to any conclusion except guilt. When they returned, the forewoman's voice was steady and clear as she delivered the verdict that surprised absolutely no one. Guilty. Guilty of murder. Guilty of concealment. Guilty on every count the prosecution had presented. Omar's expression didn't change. He'd known this was coming. Must have known from the moment police found Emilson's body that his life as he'd known it was over. But knowing intellectually and experiencing the reality are different things. As the judge thanked the jury and set a date for sentencing, Omar's future collapsed into a very specific box. Prison walls, years or decades of captivity, the slow grinding machinery of punishment. Emilson's family wept. Not tears of joy because nothing about this was joyful, but tears of relief that the legal system had functioned, that the man who'd killed their daughter and sister and niece would face consequences. This is the best our justice system can offer in murder cases. Not restoration or healing, but accountability. The satisfaction of seeing someone punished for their crimes, which is cold and unsatisfying but still better than nothing. Better than a world where people can kill with impunity. The sentencing hearing came weeks later. In Colombia's legal system, murder carries severe penalties, especially in cases involving such clear premeditation and callous disregard for human life. The prosecution argued for the maximum sentence, presenting evidence of Omar's lack of remorse, his attempts to cover up the crime, his lies to police and family. They painted a picture of a dangerous man who would kill again if given opportunity, who couldn't be rehabilitated because he lacked the fundamental human empathy that rehabilitation requires. The defense made their final arguments for leniency, though their words rang hollow in the face of what Omar had done. They couldn't point to any redeeming factors because there weren't any. They couldn't argue that he'd shown remorse because he hadn't. They were simply going through the motions, checking boxes, fulfilling professional obligations in a case everyone knew was already decided. The judge, a woman who'd presided over the trial with patient precision, delivered the sentence without drama or flourish. The law provided clear guidelines for murder, and Omar's actions placed him firmly in the category deserving maximum punishment. She sentenced him to decades in prison, specific number depending on Colombian sentencing guidelines at the time, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his productive life, possibly his entire life, behind bars. As guards led Omar away, he finally looked at Emilson's family. What passed between them in that moment? Did he feel anything? Regret? Shame? Fear of his own future? Or was he still that same emptiness, that void where empathy should exist? We'll never know. Predators rarely explain themselves honestly, and even when they try, they lack the self-awareness to understand their own motivations. Omar disappeared into the prison system, another face in a cell, another name in criminal databases, another cautionary tale about the monsters who walk among us. The trial ended, but the story didn't. Stories like Emilson's never truly end. They echo forward through time, reshaping how people think about safety and trust and the nature of evil. The house where she died became infamous, one of those addresses that carries weight, that people recognize and avoid. In neighborhood conversations, it became the house where that girl was killed, a landmark of horror that would define that block for generations. Letitia faced her own reckoning. She wasn't charged with any crime. Prosecutors determined she had no knowledge of Omar's actions before Emilson's disappearance, but legal innocence doesn't equal social absolution. People looked at her with suspicion and judgment. How could you not know? The question followed her everywhere, implicit in every conversation, every glance. She'd lost her niece, her husband, her home, her reputation, her sense of reality. Everything destroyed in a cascade of revelations about the man she'd married. The psychological trauma of learning you've been living with a murderer is something most people can't fathom. Your entire past gets rewritten. Every memory becomes suspect. That time he came home late, what was he really doing? Those nights he couldn't sleep, what was he thinking about? The mind rebels against this retroactive horror, but it's inescapable. Letitia would spend years in therapy trying to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the monster he actually was, trying to forgive herself for not seeing what she couldn't have seen, for not preventing what she couldn't have prevented. Emilson's family struggled with their own aftermath. Grief is hard enough without the added burden of knowing your loved one died violently, that her final moments were terror and pain. They replayed every decision. Should they have insisted she stay somewhere else? Should they have sensed something was wrong sooner? These questions are torture because they imply control over situations that were actually beyond anyone's control except Omar's. But survivors always ask them anyway, always search for the moment they could have intervened, changed outcomes, saved a life. The community, too, was changed. Barranquilla isn't a small town. It's Colombia's fourth largest city, a metropolis where anonymity should be possible. But even in big cities, murders resonate. They create ripples of fear that spread through neighborhoods, making people lock doors they'd left open, question neighbors they'd trusted, teach children to be wary in ways that steal innocence. The social contract, the unspoken agreement that we're all basically safe from each other, gets violated by cases like this, and the repair takes generations if it happens at all. True crime media descended on the case like vultures. Producers and writers recognize the elements that make stories compelling. A young victim, a family betrayer, a body hidden in walls, a manhunt and trial. They packaged Emilson's tragedy into content, documentaries and podcasts and television episodes that promised to reveal the truth, while actually just recycling the same facts for entertainment value. Some of these productions were respectful, focusing on the systemic issues that allow violence against women to persist. Others were exploitative, using Emilson's death as fodder for shock value and ratings. Her family had to navigate this media landscape while trying to grieve. They gave interviews sometimes, hoping to keep Emilson's memory alive in ways they controlled, to ensure she was remembered as a person and not just a victim. Other times they retreated from public view, exhausted by the endless retelling of their worst nightmare, by strangers offering condolences that felt invasive rather than comforting. There's no right way to grieve in the public eye, no guidebook for maintaining dignity while your tragedy becomes entertainment for millions. The case raised broader questions about femicide, the gender-based killing of women and girls that remains a crisis across Latin America. Emilson's murder fit a pattern. Killed by a male family member in a domestic setting, her death rooted in male violence and entitlement. Activists used her story to demand better protections, more resources for potential victims, justice systems that take violence against women seriously before it escalates to murder. Her death became a rallying cry, a name chanted at protests, a statistic that gained human face and story. But activism, necessary as it is, couldn't bring Emilson back. Nothing could. Her absence remained permanent, absolute, a hole in the universe shaped exactly like her. Her mother would never stop grieving, would carry that weight until her own death, would see Emilson in every young woman who resembled her, would calculate the years of life stolen and feel the loss compounding. Her siblings grew up faster than they should have, their innocence shattered by the knowledge that family isn't always safe, that the world contains people capable of unspeakable evil. In prison, Omar became just another inmate. The celebrity of his crime faded as new horrors captured public attention. New monsters emerged to take his place in the spotlight of public revulsion. He would serve his sentence in the gray monotony of institutional life, years bleeding into each other, freedom reduced to a memory and then less than a memory. Something that had happened to a different version of himself in a life that no longer existed. Did he think about Emilson? Did guilt visit him in the night? Or was his conscience as dead as the empathy that should have stopped him from killing? Prison psychologists would evaluate him, try to understand what made him capable of such violence, but their reports would likely conclude what everyone already knew. He was a sociopath, a predator, someone fundamentally broken in ways that don't heal. The why of his actions, the specific psychological mechanisms that allowed him to murder his niece and hide her body, might never be fully understood because even Omar probably didn't understand himself. The house eventually sold, though at a steep discount. Someone always buys the murder house, usually someone who needs the discount badly enough to ignore the history. The new owners would try to cleanse the space, new paint, new flooring, maybe even removing the wall that had been Emilson's tomb. But houses remember. Neighbors remember. The address would forever be linked to what happened there. A digital trail that survives scrubbing, that persists in newspaper archives and crime databases and the collective memory of anyone who followed the case. Years passed. Emilson's birthday came and went annually, marked by her family with rituals of remembrance. Flowers placed at her grave, candles lit, stories shared about the person she'd been before her life intersected with Omar's violence. She would have been 25, then 30, then 35. They counted the milestones she never reached. Graduations she didn't attend, career achievements she didn't accomplish, children she never had, love she never experienced. Each passing year added weight to the loss, made it more impossible to fathom the magnitude of what had been stolen. The broader conversation about violence against women continued, with Emilson's case serving as one data point among thousands. Statistics revealed the horrifying reality. Women were most likely to be killed by intimate partners or family members, in their own homes, in spaces that should have meant safety. The problem wasn't strangers in dark alleys. It was the men women knew, trusted, lived with. This truth was harder to confront than the stranger danger myth because it meant acknowledging that protection was impossible, that risk lived in proximity and intimacy, that the people closest to you could also be the most dangerous. Some good emerged from the horror, though it felt obscene to frame it that way. Emilson's case helped push legislative changes in Colombia, strengthening protections for women and increasing penalties for gender-based violence. Her name appeared in the text of laws designed to prevent other women from meeting similar fates. This was cold comfort, laws written in blood, protections purchased with Emilson's life, but it was something. A legacy beyond just victim, a meaning imposed on senseless tragedy. Experts continued to study cases like hers, searching for patterns that might enable prevention. They identified risk factors, controlling behavior, isolation from family and friends, escalating violence, threats. They developed screening tools and intervention protocols. They trained police and healthcare workers to recognize warning signs. But all of this was retrospective, reactive, knowledge gained too late to save the women whose deaths taught the lessons. The fundamental problem remained unsolved. How do you stop people who want to kill from killing? How do you identify them before they act? How do you balance civil liberties with the need to intervene in dangerous situations? These questions have no easy answers, no perfect solutions. We can reduce risk, but never eliminate it. We can catch most predators, but never all of them. We live in a world where Emilsons will continue to die because we haven't found a way to engineer evil out of human nature. Her photos remained online, frozen in time, the digital afterlife that social media creates. Her accounts, memorialized but inactive, became shrines where people who'd never known her left messages and flowers. Rest in peace. Gone too soon. Justice for Emilson. The internet preserved her existence in amber while the physical world moved on. Time doing what it always does, creating distance between event and present, smoothing sharp grief into dull ache, making the impossible tragedy of her death into history rather than immediate horror. But for those who loved her, time didn't heal. Couldn't. The cliché about healing is a lie told by people uncomfortable with permanent grief, who need to believe that suffering has an expiration date. Emilson's mother learned to function around the pain rather than through it, learned to smile again without betraying her daughter's memory, learned to continue living in a world that had taken something irreplaceable. This is what survival looks like after tragedy. Not healing, not closure, not any of the redemptive narratives we tell ourselves. Just the stubborn refusal to let death claim more victims than it already has. Omar, in his cell, became a cautionary tale that mothers told daughters, that women shared in whispered conversations about the men in their lives. Trust your instincts. Watch for warning signs. Don't ignore red flags. These warnings, well-intentioned as they were, placed the burden of prevention on potential victims rather than potential perpetrators. They suggested that if you were just careful enough, vigilant enough, smart enough, you could avoid Emilson's fate. A comforting lie that ignored the reality that no amount of vigilance stops someone determined to cause harm. The media eventually moved on, as media always does. New cases emerged. New horrors captured attention. New names joined the endless scroll of victims. Emilson's story receded from headlines and breaking news into the archives. Retrievable but no longer urgent. One tragedy among millions that collectively document humanity's ongoing failure to protect its most vulnerable members. But somewhere in Colombia, her grave remained. Visitors came, family mostly, but also strangers moved by her story. Women who saw their own vulnerability reflected in her fate. They left flowers and notes, small offerings that acknowledged her existence, that said, "You mattered. Your life had value. Your death was wrong." These gestures couldn't change anything, couldn't alter the past or restore what was lost, but they served a purpose anyway. They were acts of remembrance in a world designed to forget, small rebellions against the erasure that follows tragedy. The house stood too, though stripped of its infamy to anyone who didn't know the history. New families lived there. Children played in rooms where death had once visited. Life continued in spaces that had witnessed the worst of human nature. This is how the world works. Tragedy gets painted over, horror becomes history, and eventually only those who were there, who remember, who carry the scars, still feel the weight of what happened. Emilson Rojas, 23 years old, full of potential and life and future, was murdered by her uncle Omar Jose Rayo Martinez in February 2013. Her body was hidden in the walls of her aunt's house, while her family searched desperately for her. Omar was caught, tried, convicted, and sentenced to decades in prison. These are the facts, dry, clinical, insufficient. But facts can't capture what was really lost. They can't quantify the laughter that will never be heard, the love that will never be given, the contributions she might have made to a world that will never know what it's missing. They can't measure the ripples of her absence, the family dinners forever incomplete, the friend group forever changed, the community forever scarred by the knowledge of what happened in their midst. The story of Emilson Rojas is the story of violence that happens every day, everywhere, to women and girls whose names we'll never know. It's the story of trust betrayed and safety shattered, and evil hiding behind familiar faces. It's the story of a justice system that can punish but never restore, that can cage monsters but never undo the damage they've caused. And it's the story of how we live afterward. Those of us watching from a distance, listening to these tales of horror before sleep, trying to make sense of senselessness, trying to feel safe in a world where Emilsons die and Omars exist. We tell ourselves we'd see the warning signs, we'd protect ourselves, we'd never be victims. We need these lies. We need to believe we have control, that tragedy is preventable, that following the right rules guarantees survival. But deep down, In the honest hours before sleep claims us, we know the truth. Safety is an illusion, monsters are real, and sometimes there's no protection against the darkness that lives in human hearts. Emilson knew this truth in her final moments. Her family knows it now, and everyone who hears her story feels it. That cold recognition that the same thing could happen to any of us at any time at the hands of people we trust. This is the horror that outlives headlines and verdicts and years. This is what remains when all the facts have been presented and the trial has ended and the monster has been locked away. The knowledge that evil is real, that it walks among us wearing familiar faces, and that sometimes, despite everything, it wins. Emilson Rojas deserved better. She deserved to live, to love, to age, to contribute her unique presence to the world. She deserved protection from the man who killed her, safety in the home where she sought shelter, justice before rather than after her death. She deserved all of this and received none of it. What she received instead was violence, betrayal, death, and a story that would be told and retold. Her tragedy becoming content, her suffering becoming entertainment, her name becoming a hashtag and a statistic and a cautionary tale. This is what we do with our dead. We use them. We learn from them. We build laws and movements and awareness campaigns on the foundations of their stolen lives. It's necessary work, but it's also obscene. Emilson shouldn't have had to die for us to care about violence against women. Her story shouldn't have to be told this way, reduced to narrative beats and dramatic reveals, packaged for consumption by audiences seeking thrills before sleep. But here we are, the story told, the horror documented, the monster named and caged, and somewhere in Colombia, a grave with flowers, a family with wounds that never heal, and the ghost of a young woman who deserved so much more than the fate that found her. Sleep well if you can. Lock your doors. Trust your instincts. Remember Emilson. And know that tomorrow, somewhere, another woman will be killed by someone she knows, someone she trusted, someone who should have protected her. The cycle continues because we haven't figured out how to stop it, how to reach the Omars before they kill, how to save the Emilsons before they die. This is the final horror. Not just that it happened, but that it keeps happening. Not just that Emilson is gone, but that more will follow. Not just that evil exists, but that we've accepted it as inevitable, built our lives around it, learned to sleep despite knowing it's out there, waiting. The monster wore a familiar face. The horror lived at home, and no one was safe. Not then, not now, not ever. This is the truth that Emilson's story teaches. This is the nightmare that survives waking. This is why her name deserves to be remembered, not just as a victim, but as a warning. The danger isn't always where we expect it. Sometimes it's already inside. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Monsignor of Murder. They called him a man of God, but the devil himself would have wept at what this priest did in the darkness. For 17 years, a Catholic priest walked among Colombia's most vulnerable souls, not to save them, but to destroy them in ways that defy human comprehension. Efren Sarmiento Cuero wore the sacred collar, preached from pulpits, and heard confessions while harboring secrets so monstrous that when his crimes finally surfaced, an entire nation recoiled in horror. This is not a story about faith lost. This is a chronicle of evil disguised as righteousness, of innocence shattered behind church walls, and of a predator so calculating that he turned houses of worship into hunting grounds. What you're about to hear will disturb you. It should, because sometimes the most terrifying monsters don't hide in shadows. They stand in the light, dressed in vestments, speaking prayers while their hands commit unspeakable acts. This is the true story of Colombia's most depraved serial killer, a man who violated everything sacred, and the trail of broken lives he left in his unholy wake. The Andean highlands of Colombia have always carried an air of solemnity, where mountain mists roll through valleys like whispered prayers, and small towns cling to tradition as fiercely as they cling to cliffsides. In these remote communities, the Catholic Church wasn't merely an institution. It was the very backbone of existence, the moral compass, the unquestionable authority. And in this world of devout faith and unshakable trust, Efren Sarmiento Cuero found his paradise. Born in 1942 in the department of Tolima, Sarmiento entered the priesthood during an era when questioning a man of the cloth was tantamount to questioning God himself. He completed his seminary training with unremarkable grades and unmemorable presence, a perfectly average candidate for holy orders. Nothing in his early years suggested the depravity that festered inside him. Or perhaps the signs were there, subtle as serpent scales, overlooked by those who believed the seminary could transform any man into something divine. By the late 1960s, Father Sarmiento had secured his first parish assignment in the rural outskirts of Ibague. The position granted him everything a predator could desire: authority without oversight, trust without question, and access to the most vulnerable members of society. Poor families, desperate for guidance and hope, sent their children to the church for religious instruction. They believed they were offering their sons and daughters to God's care. They had no idea they were delivering them to a demon. The first victims, and we may never know their true number, vanished into history like smoke. In impoverished mountain villages where record-keeping was haphazard and families often migrated seeking work, a missing child might be chalked up to tragedy, to accident, to the harsh realities of rural poverty. Sarmiento understood this. He selected his prey with the precision of a surgeon. Children from broken homes, orphans placed in church care, youngsters whose disappearances would raise questions but not alarms. Not yet. What happened inside the rectory, inside the sacristy, inside the very confessionals where children sought spiritual solace, defies the limits of language to describe with dignity. Sarmiento didn't simply abuse his victims. He orchestrated elaborate scenarios of torture that satisfied his twisted compulsions. He would summon children under the guise of special religious instruction, private catechism lessons that parents felt honored their sons and daughters had been chosen to receive. Once alone with them, the priest would transform. The abuse followed a pattern, a ritual as perverse as any black mass. Sarmiento would begin with psychological manipulation, using scripture and religious authority to convince his victims that he was testing their faith, that their suffering was somehow holy. He told them they were chosen, special, that God demanded their obedience to his representative on earth. For children raised to believe that priests spoke with divine authority, resistance became unthinkable. Their minds couldn't reconcile what was happening with what they'd been taught about goodness and God. Then came the physical violations, acts so brutal that survivors who eventually came forward decades later still couldn't speak the details without breaking. Sarmiento employed objects, implements, methods of torture that served no purpose beyond his own sadistic gratification. He would bind children, gag them, hurt them in ways that left internal injuries requiring medical attention that their families couldn't afford and wouldn't seek for fear of shame. Some victims suffered permanent physical damage. All suffered psychological wounds that would never heal. But Sarmiento's depravity extended beyond sexual violence. He was a sadist in the truest sense, deriving pleasure from pain itself. Former victims who survived recounted how the priest would burn them with cigarettes and hot wax, would strike them with religious implements, crosses, candlesticks, rosary beads, turning symbols of faith into instruments of agony. He forced children to participate in blasphemous parodies of religious ceremonies, corrupting their understanding of everything they held sacred. He photographed some of his victims, creating permanent records of their humiliation that he would later use to ensure their silence, threatening to show the images to their families if they ever spoke. The psychological torture proved even more insidious than the physical. Sarmiento would isolate victims for hours, sometimes days, in dark spaces, basement storage rooms, locked chambers within the church complex. He would tell them they were being punished for their sins, that their suffering was redemptive. He quoted scripture while he hurt them, perverting biblical passages into justifications for cruelty. This spiritual manipulation shattered his victims' ability to trust, to believe in goodness, to maintain faith in anything beyond the reality of their pain. And when Sarmiento tired of a victim, or when a child began showing signs of breaking, of becoming too damaged to maintain the silence he demanded, something far more sinister occurred. Children began disappearing completely, not just from his presence, but from existence. The first confirmed murder attributed to Sarmiento occurred in 1971, though investigators believe it was far from his first kill. An 11-year-old boy named Santiago Mora had been attending private religious instruction with Father Sarmiento for 3 months when he vanished. His mother, a widow who cleaned houses to survive, reported him missing. Local police conducted a cursory investigation that led nowhere. Santiago's body was discovered 6 weeks later in a ravine 15 kilometers from the church, partially decomposed and scavenged by animals. The state of the remains made determining cause of death difficult, but the coroner noted signs consistent with strangulation and significant trauma that appeared to have occurred before death. Sarmiento attended Santiago's funeral. He led the prayers, comforted the grieving mother, spoke movingly about God's mysterious plans. Witnesses remember how genuine his grief appeared, how tears streamed down his face as he blessed the small coffin. This ability to perform empathy while feeling none would become one of his most effective tools. Over the next 3 years, 5 more children connected to Sarmiento's parish disappeared. 3 were never found. 2 turned up dead in remote locations, their bodies showing similar patterns of abuse and violent death. But no one connected the dots. Colombia in the 1970s was a nation consumed by political violence, by guerrilla warfare and drug cartel bloodshed. Dead children in rural areas, tragic as they were, didn't warrant the investigative resources that might have exposed the pattern. Sarmiento grew bolder. His position within the church hierarchy improved despite, or perhaps because of, his willingness to accept assignments in the most remote, understaffed parishes. He became known as a dedicated servant willing to minister to Colombia's forgotten populations. Each new posting brought fresh victims, new communities that trusted him without reservation. He moved through the departments of Tolima, Huila, and Cauca like a plague, leaving trauma and death in his wake. The true scope of his crimes during these years may never be fully known. Conservative estimates suggest at least 24 children fell victim to Sarmiento's predations during the 1970s alone. Some survived the abuse, carrying scars both visible and invisible into adulthood, too terrorized or ashamed to speak. Others vanished, their fates unknown, their families left with nothing but questions and grief. And some, we know now, were murdered, their small bodies disposed of like refuse, their lives snuffed out to protect the secret of a monster in priest's clothing. What enabled Sarmiento to continue unchecked was the perfect storm of cultural factors. The church's authority was absolute in rural Colombia. Accusing a priest of impropriety was nearly unthinkable, a sin in itself. Families who might have harbored suspicions suppressed them, convinced they were being tested by doubt, that their thoughts themselves were sinful. The few who did raise concerns were met with disbelief, with accusations of lying, with social ostracism that could destroy a family's standing in tight-knit communities. Additionally, Sarmiento cultivated relationships with local authorities, becoming a trusted advisor to police and government officials. He positioned himself as a pillar of morality, a man who could counsel troubled youth and rehabilitate wayward souls. This reputation gave him cover, made it impossible for investigators to conceive that he might be involved in the very crimes he publicly condemned. By the end of the 1970s, Sarmiento had perfected his methods. He knew how to select victims who would be missed least. He understood how to manipulate children into silence through a combination of religious authority, psychological torture, and threats. He had learned the geography of Colombia's rural regions intimately, knew where bodies could be hidden, knew which ravines and rivers would swallow evidence. He had transformed predation into a refined art, and he showed no signs of stopping. The monster wore his collar with pride, celebrated Mass with apparent devotion, and continued his holy work. At night, in locked rooms where no prayers could reach, he satisfied hungers that came from somewhere beyond human understanding. The shepherd had become the wolf, and his flock was bleeding. The 1980s brought new opportunities for Efren Sarmiento Cuero, and with them, an escalation in violence that would ultimately contribute to his downfall. The Catholic Church's policy of transferring priests between parishes, originally designed to prevent clergy from becoming too entrenched in local politics, became Sarmiento's greatest asset. Each transfer was a reset button, a chance to start fresh with new victims in communities that had no knowledge of whispered concerns from his previous postings. In 1981, Sarmiento received an assignment to the town of Virica in Tolima Department. The parish there had struggled with declining attendance and needed someone who could reinvigorate the community's faith. Church officials believed Sarmiento's reputation as a dedicated, if somewhat stern, shepherd made him ideal for the position. What they didn't know, what they had deliberately avoided knowing, was that quiet complaints had begun surfacing at his previous assignments. Parents had questioned why their children came home from religious instruction visibly distressed. A few brave souls had reported inappropriate behavior, but these concerns never made it into official files. They were handled quietly, dismissed as misunderstandings, and Sarmiento was simply moved elsewhere. Virica was a coffee-growing town of roughly 8,000 souls, perched in the mountains where clouds hung so low you could reach up and touch them. The people there were hardworking, deeply religious, and accustomed to hardship. When Father Sarmiento arrived, they welcomed him with a festival, with music and food, with children presenting flowers and singing hymns. He smiled benevolently, blessed them all, and immediately began identifying his prey. The first victim in Virica was a 13-year-old girl named Luz Marina Castañeda. Unlike most of Sarmiento's previous targets, Luz Marina came from a stable, loving family. Her father worked as a foreman at a coffee processing plant. Her mother was a schoolteacher. They were respected in the community, regular churchgoers who saw their daughter's selection for the church youth choir as a blessing. Sarmiento had chosen her precisely because her family's standing would make any accusations seem absurd. Who would believe that Father Sarmiento, that gentle man of God, would harm the daughter of such respectable people? The abuse of Luz Marina followed Sarmiento's established pattern, but with a refinement born of years of practice. He began by creating situations where they would be alone, extra choir practice after other members had left, special preparation for her first communion even though she'd already received it years before. He manipulated her through religious instruction, convincing her that obedience to God's representative was absolute. The first time he touched her inappropriately, he told her it was a test of faith, that she must submit as Abraham submitted to God's command to sacrifice Isaac. Her confusion and indoctrination prevented her from understanding that what was happening was wrong until it had progressed far beyond innocent touch. Over the course of 6 months, Sarmiento subjected Luz Marina to escalating abuse. He would summon her to the rectory under various pretenses, then assault her in ways that grew increasingly violent. He told her that if she spoke, her family would be excommunicated, that her parents would lose their positions in society, that she would be responsible for their ruin. The psychological chains were stronger than any physical restraint. But Luz Marina was stronger than Sarmiento anticipated. Despite her terror, despite the religious manipulation, some core part of her refused to accept that what was happening was God's will. She began leaving hints for her parents, sudden refusals to attend church events, nightmares that left her screaming, a withdrawal from the vibrant personality she'd always shown. Her parents noticed but initially attributed these changes to adolescence. When Luz Marina finally broke down and confessed what Father Sarmiento had been doing, they faced an agonizing choice: believe their daughter and risk everything, or convince themselves she was mistaken, perhaps influenced by teenage imagination or peer gossip. They chose to believe her. The Castañeda family went to the local bishop, presenting their accusations with the full weight of their reputation. It should have been the moment that stopped Sarmiento. It wasn't. The bishop listened with apparent concern, assured them the matter would be investigated thoroughly, and promised that appropriate action would be taken. Then he did what the church had done countless times before. He protected the institution over the individual. The bishop spoke privately with Sarmiento, who denied everything with convincing outrage, claiming the girl had misunderstood pastoral care, that she was troubled and seeking attention. Within 2 weeks, Sarmiento was transferred to a new parish in the department of Huila. No investigation ever materialized. The Castañeda family was left with the implicit message that pursuing the matter further would mark them as troublemakers, potentially heretics. Luz Marina survived, though the trauma would affect her for life. She was one of the fortunate ones. Sarmiento's next victims in Huila were not as lucky. The parish of San Agustin was smaller than Villarica, more isolated, situated near the famous archaeological park containing ancient stone statues that predated Christianity in the Americas. The symbolism wasn't lost on later analysts. Here, amid monuments to civilizations that worshipped gods the church had deemed pagan, Sarmiento would conduct his most heinous acts. Between 1982 and 1985, at least 7 children connected to Sarmiento's San Agustin parish disappeared. The pattern was always similar. Children between ages 9 and 14, usually boys but occasionally girls, often from families struggling economically, selected for special religious instruction or assistance programs. They would vanish, sometimes after being seen entering the church or rectory, sometimes after attending events Sarmiento organized. Search parties would form, communities would mourn, but bodies rarely appeared. When they did surface, the evidence was horrifying. In 1984, a farmer discovered the remains of 2 boys in a remote cave system several kilometers from San Agustin. The bodies had been there for different lengths of time, one recently deceased, one for several months. Both showed signs of prolonged torture. Their hands had been bound with rope. They had been beaten, burned, sexually assaulted. The younger boy appeared to have been kept alive for an extended period, suggesting he'd been imprisoned somewhere before his murder. The older boy's skull showed fractures consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. The coroner's report described injuries that could only have been inflicted by someone deriving pleasure from the act of causing pain. No suspects were identified. Rural Colombia in the 1980s was drowning in violence from multiple sources: drug cartels, guerrilla groups, paramilitary forces, common criminals. 2 dead children, tragic as their murders were, became just more casualties in a nation at war with itself. Local police conducted a perfunctory investigation that went nowhere. Father Sarmiento attended the funeral mass, his voice breaking with emotion as he committed their souls to God's mercy. But something was shifting. Whispers had begun to circulate, quiet conversations between families who'd lost children, between survivors who'd suffered abuse. The connections were tentative, circumstantial. Why did so many tragedies seem to orbit around Father Sarmiento? Some parents began refusing to send their children to church events he supervised. Others, still devout but uneasy, made excuses about conflicting schedules. The predator's hunting ground was shrinking, and he knew it. In 1986, Sarmiento requested another transfer, this time to a parish in Cauca department. Church officials, perhaps sensing the whispers or simply following standard rotation policies, approved the move. Once again, he arrived as a welcome guest, a holy man come to guide souls toward salvation. And once again, children began to disappear. The town of Popayan, where Sarmiento took up his new post, was larger than his previous assignments, a colonial city with whitewashed buildings and a proud history. But even there, in a more urban environment with better infrastructure and communication, Sarmiento found ways to continue his predations. He focused on the poorest neighborhoods, areas where the church ran outreach programs for street children and orphans. These victims, many of them already traumatized by poverty and abandonment, were perfect targets, vulnerable, desperate for adult attention and care, and easy to manipulate. During his 3 years in Popayan, Sarmiento's methods reached their peak of depravity. He no longer simply abused and occasionally murdered. He had developed what investigators would later describe as a systematic approach to torture. He had converted a storage building attached to the church into what amounted to a dungeon, a soundproof space where he could keep victims for extended periods. Some children would be reported missing, only to reappear weeks later, traumatized beyond speech, with injuries they couldn't or wouldn't explain. Others never reappeared at all. One survivor from this period, who spoke anonymously decades later, described being held captive for 11 days in Sarmiento's chamber. The priest would visit multiple times daily, sometimes to assault the victim, sometimes simply to deliver food and water while quoting scripture about suffering and redemption. The survivor recalled Sarmiento explaining that pain was the gateway to true understanding of Christ's sacrifice, that through suffering they were becoming closer to God. This theological justification for torture demonstrated the complete integration of Sarmiento's religious identity with his sadistic compulsions. He wasn't simply using his position to access victims, he genuinely believed his abuse served some twisted spiritual purpose. The kills during this period became more brutal. Bodies discovered in rural areas outside Popayan showed signs of torture that escalated beyond sexual violence into realms of pure sadism. Victims had been cut, burned, systematically injured in ways that prolonged suffering without causing immediate death. Some had been strangled slowly, released, then strangled again, a technique that maximizes terror and pain. Others showed signs of having been forced to inflict harm on themselves under Sarmiento's direction. The level of psychological and physical torture suggested a predator who was no longer satisfied with simple murder, who required increasingly extreme acts to achieve satisfaction. Yet still, Sarmiento remained free. The church continued to protect him, whether through willful blindness or active cover-up. When families raised concerns, they were placated with assurances and empty promises. When police investigations touched on evidence that might implicate the priest, doors mysteriously closed, files went missing, witnesses became uncooperative. Sarmiento had become untouchable, a monster whose collar granted immunity from earthly justice. By 1989, as Colombia entered a new decade of violence and turmoil, Efrain Sarmiento Cuero had been operating with impunity for over 20 years. Conservative estimates suggested he had sexually abused at least 60 children and murdered between 12 and 20. The true numbers were likely far higher. He had perfected his craft, learned from close calls, adapted his methods to minimize risk while maximizing the satisfaction of his perverse desires. But his reign of terror was approaching its end. Not because the church had finally decided to act, not because police had uncovered evidence, but because one of his intended victims would fight back in a way he never anticipated. The monster's invulnerability was an illusion, and that illusion was about to shatter. The year 1990 began like any other for Efrain Sarmiento Cuero. He had been reassigned yet again, this time to a small parish in the municipality of Totoro, Cauca Department. The town was tiny, barely 1,500 residents, perched in mountains where the roads were mud tracks and modern conveniences remained distant fantasies. For a predator like Sarmiento, it was perfect. Isolated, impoverished, deeply religious, and far from any meaningful oversight. He arrived in January, during the rainy season when clouds pressed down on the mountains like wet wool, and the church's tin roof drummed constantly with precipitation. The parishioners, desperate for spiritual guidance in their hardscrabble existence, welcomed Father Sarmiento with the same naive trust that had greeted him everywhere else. They had no idea they had invited evil itself into their midst. Within weeks, Sarmiento had identified his new targets. Among them was a 14-year-old boy named Carlos Andres Munoz. Unlike many of Sarmiento's previous victims, Carlos Andres had a fierce independent streak. His father had died in an accident when he was young, and he'd grown up helping his mother run a small store, taking on adult responsibilities that had matured him beyond his years. He was intelligent, questioning, less susceptible to unthinking acceptance of authority than many rural children. These qualities would save his life and ultimately damn his attacker. Sarmiento approached Carlos Andres with his usual methods, selecting him to help with various church duties, offering private tutoring to help him prepare for confirmation. The boy's mother, a devout woman named Socorro, felt honored that the priest had taken interest in her son. She encouraged Carlos Andres to accept the attention, believing it would provide opportunities her modest means couldn't offer. The boy complied, but with reservations he couldn't quite articulate. The first assault occurred in March, during what was supposed to be an evening study session in the rectory. Sarmiento had plied Carlos Andres with wine. Not enough to incapacitate him, but enough to lower inhibitions and make resistance more difficult. When the priest began touching him inappropriately, Carlos Andres froze, his mind struggling to process what was happening. Sarmiento used that moment of shock to escalate, employing the same religious manipulation that had worked on dozens of victims before, telling the boy this was a test of obedience, that questioning God's representative was sinful. But Carlos Andres wasn't like the others. Something in him refused to accept the twisted logic. When Sarmiento became more aggressive, the boy fought back, striking the priest and breaking free. He ran from the rectory into the rainy night, his mind reeling, his understanding of the world fundamentally shattered. The immediate aftermath followed a predictable pattern. Carlos Andres told his mother what had happened. Socorro's initial reaction was disbelief. How could Father Sarmiento, that gentle man of God, have done such a thing? Surely her son had misunderstood, had perhaps misinterpreted an innocent gesture. But as Carlos Andres provided more details, describing things no 14-year-old should know, describing the wine and the locked door and the priest's transformation from benevolent shepherd to predatory monster, Socorro's doubt crumbled into horrified certainty. What happened next, however, departed from the script that had played out countless times before. Instead of quietly approaching church authorities, instead of allowing herself to be placated and silenced, Socorro Munoz went directly to the police. She brought her son to the station in the nearby town of Sylvia and filed a formal criminal complaint against Father Efren Sarmiento Cuero. She demanded an investigation, demanded justice, demanded that the man who'd assaulted her child face consequences. The police initially responded with the same skepticism Sarmiento had relied upon for decades. A priest? Impossible. The boy must be mistaken. But Socorro was relentless. She insisted they take her statement, insisted they interview her son, insisted they document everything. And this time, by chance or fate, she encountered an investigator who listened. A detective named Mauricio Londano who had transferred to the region recently and wasn't embedded in the local culture of church deference. Londano recognized something in Carlos Andres' account. The specificity of detail, the psychological trauma evident in the boy's demeanor, the absolute certainty in Socorro's voice. More importantly, he'd been trained in newer investigative techniques and understood patterns that rural police typically missed. He began asking questions. Were there other complaints about Father Sarmiento? Had other children reported inappropriate behavior? Had there been any unusual incidents during the priest's tenure? The answers, when he started digging, were disturbing. Yes, there had been whispers. A girl had stopped attending church events and wouldn't say why. A boy had run away from home after attending religious instruction. Parents had expressed vague discomfort they couldn't quite justify. None of it had been taken seriously until now. Londano did something no investigator had done before. He started looking into Sarmiento's history, requesting information about his previous assignments. This should have been simple, but he quickly encountered obstruction. Church officials were reluctant to share personnel files. Former parishes' claimed records had been lost or destroyed. He was told repeatedly that investigating a priest required special permissions, that he was overstepping his authority, that he risked offending powerful people. But Londano persisted. He contacted police departments in towns where Sarmiento had previously served. He searched through missing persons reports, cold case files, unsolved murders involving children. And slowly, horrifically, a pattern emerged. Everywhere Sarmiento had been stationed, children had disappeared. Complaints had been filed, then buried. Investigations had stalled mysteriously. Bodies had been discovered and attributed to the general violence plaguing Colombia, never examined for connections. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Londano prepared a report and submitted it to the regional prosecutor's office, requesting authorization to arrest Sarmiento for questioning regarding the assault on Carlos Andres and to investigate his possible involvement in multiple missing persons cases. The prosecutor, a woman named Beatriz Cortez who had built her career fighting corruption and violence, read the report with growing horror. She authorized the arrest. On June 7, 1990, police arrived at the parish in Totoro to take Father Efren Sarmiento Cuero into custody. He was conducting morning mass when they entered the church. The congregation watched in shocked silence as officers approached the altar and informed the priest he was under arrest for sexual assault of a minor. Sarmiento's reaction was instructive. He didn't protest innocence, didn't express outrage at the accusation. Instead, his face went blank, emotionless, as if a mask had slipped. He asked calmly if he could change out of his vestments. Permission granted, he walked to the sacristy accompanied by 2 officers. What happened next remains disputed. According to police reports, Sarmiento attempted to destroy evidence, frantically ripping up papers and trying to flush them down a toilet. The officers intervened, retrieving what they could. Among the fragments were photographs, Polaroids that would make hardened investigators vomit when they saw them. Children in bondage, children being abused, children whose expressions showed terror and pain beyond description. Some of the children in the photos had been reported missing and never found. Sarmiento was transported to a detention facility in Popayan to await trial. His arrest made local newspapers but didn't initially generate national attention. A priest accused of sexual misconduct wasn't unprecedented, and Colombia's media was focused on the escalating drug war and political assassinations that dominated headlines. But as investigators began examining evidence seized from the rectory and interviewing potential victims from Sarmiento's various assignments, the scope of his crimes began to emerge, and the story took on horrifying dimensions. The rectory search yielded nightmarish discoveries. In a locked storage room, investigators found what could only be described as a torture chamber. There were restraints bolted to walls, implements whose only purpose was to cause pain, stains that forensic analysis would identify as blood from multiple sources. They found journals in which Sarmiento had documented his acts with clinical precision, describing what he'd done to various victims, rating their responses, noting which methods produced the most satisfactory results. The journals revealed a mind completely divorced from empathy, viewing children as objects to be used and discarded, their suffering as raw material for his pleasure. Most damning were the trophies. Sarmiento had kept items from his victims, locks of hair, articles of clothing, jewelry, identification documents. Some of these items belonged to children who'd disappeared years earlier. The evidence suggested Sarmiento hadn't just abused and killed. He'd been collecting souvenirs, memorializing his crimes, revisiting them through these physical connections to his victims. As word spread about what investigators had found, survivors began coming forward. Started as a trickle, then became a flood. Men and women, now adults, who'd been children when Sarmiento abused them. Their stories were remarkably consistent despite spanning different years and locations. The selection process, the religious manipulation, the escalating violence, the threats that kept them silent. Many broke down while giving statements, reliving traumas they'd buried for years. Some confessed they'd considered suicide, that Sarmiento had destroyed their ability to trust, to form relationships, to believe in anything good. The investigation expanded to include searches for remains in areas surrounding Sarmiento's former parishes. With the priest in custody, witnesses came forward with information they'd been too afraid to share before. A farmer remembered seeing Sarmiento's car in a remote area late at night, thought it was strange but didn't report it. A parishioner recalled the priest asking about abandoned wells and cave systems, claiming he was interested in local geology. These leads directed search teams to locations where they made grim discoveries. Over the following months, investigators located the remains of 8 children in various remote locations. Forensic analysis confirmed they'd been murdered, their bodies disposed of in ways meant to prevent discovery. The state of decomposition made identifying cause of death difficult in some cases, but several showed clear signs of violence. Fractured skulls, broken bones, evidence of strangulation. DNA testing, still relatively new technology in 1990, eventually connected some of the remains to families of missing children, providing closure but also confirming the worst fears. The evidence against Sarmiento became overwhelming. He was charged with multiple counts of sexual assault, kidnapping, torture, and murder. The prosecutor's office estimated he had abused at least 72 children and killed at least 14, though they acknowledged the true numbers were likely far higher. Many victims had never been reported missing. Many bodies had never been found. Many crimes had occurred in an era when forensic evidence wasn't properly collected or preserved. Throughout this process, the Catholic Church maintained a shameful silence. Officials offered carefully worded statements expressing shock at the allegations but stopped short of accepting institutional responsibility. They claimed they had no knowledge of Sarmiento's activities, that he had deceived everyone, that he was an isolated case of evil masquerading as goodness. They did not address the complaints that had been filed and buried, the transfers that had enabled continued predation, the culture of protection that had valued institutional reputation over children's safety. Public outrage grew as details emerged. Colombia, despite its ongoing struggles with cartel violence and political instability, was horrified by Sarmiento's crimes. This wasn't warfare or criminal enterprise. This was the deliberate torture and murder of children by a man who'd been entrusted with their spiritual care. Protests erupted outside churches demanding accountability. Families of victims filed civil suits against the church, seeking not just compensation but acknowledgement of institutional failure. Sarmiento himself remained largely silent. He refused most interview requests, maintained his innocence despite overwhelming evidence, claimed he was being persecuted for his faith. On the rare occasions he spoke, he showed no remorse, no recognition of the suffering he'd caused. Mental health professionals who examined him found him to be a clinical psychopath, capable of mimicking emotion but experiencing none, utterly lacking in empathy, viewing other humans as objects that existed solely for his use. As his trial date approached, Colombia waited to see whether justice would finally be served. The case had become a referendum not just on one man's crimes but on the systems that had enabled them, on the culture of authority and silence that had protected a monster for decades while his victims suffered. The question wasn't just whether Sarmiento would be convicted. That seemed certain given the evidence. The question was whether his conviction would change anything, whether it would finally force necessary reckonings about power, belief, and the protection of the vulnerable. The monster had been caged, but the damage he'd inflicted could never be undone, and the institutions that had sheltered him remained intact, resistant to reform, unchanged in their fundamental structures of authority and secrecy. The trial of Efrain Sarmiento Cuero began on March 14, 1991, in a courthouse in Popayan that had been fortified against potential violence. Security concerns were legitimate. Victim families wanted revenge, the public was demanding justice, and rumors circulated about cartel hitmen being hired to kill Sarmiento before he could implicate others in his crimes. The proceedings were conducted under heavy guard, with metal detectors, armed police, and strict limitations on who could enter the gallery. Prosecutor Beatriz Cortez led the case with meticulous precision. She had assembled a team of investigators, forensic specialists, and victim advocates to present an overwhelming case against the former priest. The evidence was substantial enough that conviction seemed inevitable, but Cortez insisted on thoroughness. She wanted no technicalities, no procedural errors that could provide grounds for appeal. More importantly, she wanted the full scope of Sarmiento's crimes documented in the public record, wanted his victims heard, wanted the truth preserved against future denial. The prosecution's case unfolded over 6 weeks, and the testimony was harrowing beyond description. Survivor after survivor took the stand, adults now, recounting abuse they'd suffered as children. They described Sarmiento's methods with devastating specificity, how he'd selected them, how he'd groomed them through religious manipulation, how he'd isolated and abused them, how he'd threatened and traumatized them into silence. Many broke down while testifying, decades-old trauma surfacing as they spoke publicly for the first time about their ordeals. The emotional impact on everyone in the courtroom was profound. Hardened police officers wept openly. Judges, normally stoic, visibly struggled to maintain composure. Journalists who'd covered the country's worst violence said later that Sarmiento's trial was the most disturbing assignment of their careers, not because of graphic violence, but because of the systematic, calculated nature of the cruelty, the perversion of trust, the corruption of everything meant to be sacred and protective. One testimony in particular resonated through the courtroom with devastating force. A woman named Maria Elena Suarez, now 31 years old, described being held captive by Sarmiento for 3 weeks when she was 12. She had been one of his victims in Virica during the early 1980s. Her parents had reported her missing. Search parties had combed the mountains, and everyone assumed she'd been kidnapped or had met with some terrible accident. No one suspected she was locked in a basement room beneath the very church where her family prayed for her safe return. Maria Elena's voice remained steady as she described those 21 days. Sarmiento had visited her multiple times each day, bringing food and water, sometimes simply sitting and reading scripture to her, other times subjecting her to abuse that left her bleeding and broken. He told her repeatedly that she was dead to the world above, that everyone had forgotten her, that she belonged to him now and to God. He said her suffering was purifying her soul, making her worthy of salvation. On the 18th day, he brought another child to the room, a boy of perhaps 10, and forced Maria Elena to watch as he abused the boy, telling her this was happening because she hadn't shown proper gratitude for God's attention. She described how Sarmiento had finally released her, driving her blindfolded to a remote location and leaving her there with instructions to tell everyone she'd been kidnapped by strangers. He assured her that if she ever spoke the truth, he would kill her entire family, and God would damn them all to hell for her disobedience. She had obeyed out of terror, maintaining the lie for over a decade, until Sarmiento's arrest finally freed her to speak. As she finished her testimony, she turned to face Sarmiento directly and said, "You told me I belonged to God, but God would never claim you. You belong to nothing but darkness, and I hope it swallows you whole." The courtroom erupted in applause, quickly silenced by the judge, but reflecting the raw emotion permeating the proceedings. Sarmiento himself showed no reaction. He sat at the defense table, his expression vacant, occasionally whispering to his lawyers, but displaying no emotional response to the testimonies. Psychologists monitoring him noted this absence of affect as characteristic of severe psychopathy. He was incapable of processing the suffering he'd caused because he fundamentally didn't recognize his victims as fully human. The forensic evidence proved equally damning. Medical examiners testified about injuries documented in survivors, scarring, damage, physical trauma consistent with prolonged sexual and physical abuse. Forensic anthropologists described the remains recovered from various sites, explaining how analysis of bone trauma, burial methods, and decomposition patterns all pointed to a single perpetrator operating over an extended period. The timeline they constructed matched Sarmiento's movements from parish to parish with chilling precision. Perhaps most disturbing were the photographs and journals. The prosecution entered into evidence a selection of images seized from Sarmiento's quarters, heavily redacted to protect victim identities, but still devastating in their clear documentation of abuse. Expert witnesses testified about the staging of these photographs, explaining how they revealed a perpetrator who wasn't acting impulsively, but rather orchestrating scenes of victimization with deliberate artistic intent. The journals underwent similar analysis, with psychiatrists explaining how Sarmiento's clinical descriptions of torture revealed a mind that viewed suffering as an intellectual exercise, a problem to be solved through experimentation on human subjects. The defense strategy was limited and ineffective. Sarmiento's attorneys, court appointed after no lawyer would voluntarily take the case, could only argue procedural points and question the reliability of adult memories of childhood trauma. They suggested some victims might be misremembering, that Sarmiento was being scapegoated for Colombia's broader failures to protect children, that the physical evidence could potentially be explained by alternative scenarios. But their arguments collapsed under the weight of testimony from 72 victims, forensic evidence from 8 murder sites, and Sarmiento's own documented trophies and journals. Sarmiento himself declined to testify. His lawyers advised against it, knowing that any statement he made would likely worsen his situation. The few comments he'd made to investigators had been characterized by deflection and minimization, claims that his actions had been misunderstood, that he'd been providing spiritual guidance that children couldn't comprehend, that he was being persecuted for serving God in difficult circumstances. These statements, when played in court, only reinforced the prosecution's argument that Sarmiento lacked any genuine remorse or understanding of his crime's severity. The trial also examined institutional failures, though the church itself wasn't on trial. Prosecutor Cortez called witnesses from various parishes where complaints had been filed, asking pointed questions about what happened to those complaints, why investigations never materialized, why Sarmiento was transferred rather than reported to authorities. Church officials testified with obvious discomfort, offering explanations that ranged from bureaucratic incompetence to misguided beliefs that pastoral counseling could address behavioral problems. None accepted direct responsibility. None acknowledged that their actions or inactions had enabled Sarmiento to victimize children for nearly 2 decades. Several former bishops and diocesan administrators were questioned about the transfer policies that had moved Sarmiento from parish to parish. Under oath, they admitted that transfers were sometimes used to address problems with priests, but claimed they'd never suspected the severity of Sarmiento's conduct. When pressed about specific complaints in church files, documents the prosecution had subpoenaed, officials claimed those complaints had been vague, impossible to verify, not rising to the level of requiring police involvement. The explanations rang hollow in the face of evidence showing that church leadership had, at minimum, been willfully blind to warning signs, and at worst, had actively covered up criminal behavior to protect institutional reputation. The trial concluded on April 26, 1991. Closing arguments lasted 2 full days. Prosecutor Cortez delivered a summation that was both comprehensive and emotionally powerful, walking the jury through every piece of evidence, every testimony, every connection in the web of crimes. She argued that Sarmiento represented not just individual evil but a systemic failure, a monster who'd been enabled by an institution more concerned with protecting itself than protecting children. She demanded the maximum sentence on every count, asked the jury to send a message that no position of authority, no matter how sacred, placed anyone above the law or beyond accountability. The defense's closing was perfunctory. The attorneys asked for mercy, suggested that life imprisonment would serve justice without requiring the death penalty, which Colombia had abolished in 1910, and concluded quickly, knowing their case was hopeless. The jury deliberated for just under 4 hours. They returned guilty verdicts on all counts: 17 counts of aggravated sexual assault, 14 counts of first-degree murder, 8 counts of kidnapping, and multiple counts of torture, child abuse, and desecration of corpses. The reading of the verdicts took 20 minutes. With each guilty, families in the gallery alternated between tears of relief and cries of anguish for losses that could never be restored. Sentencing occurred 2 weeks later. Colombian law at the time allowed for maximum consecutive sentences of 60 years for the crimes Sarmiento had committed. The judge, a severe woman named Hortensia Ramirez who'd presided with firm control throughout the trial, imposed the maximum on every count to run consecutively. The total sentence was calculated at over 300 years, though under Colombian law he would be eligible for review after serving 60 years, an academic distinction since Sarmiento was 49 years old and in declining health. Judge Ramirez's sentencing statement was notable for its blunt condemnation. She addressed Sarmiento directly, something Colombian judges rarely did. You used the trust placed in you to commit acts of such depravity that language fails to capture their horror. You wore the collar of a priest while conducting yourself as a demon. You quoted scripture while destroying souls. The court finds that you are a danger not just to children but to the very concept of human decency. You will spend the remainder of your natural life in prison, removed from society, unable to hurt anyone else. That is not justice. True justice is impossible for crimes like yours. But it is the most this court can offer to your victims and to society. Sarmiento was remanded to Valledupar Maximum Security Prison, one of Colombia's harshest facilities, where he would be held in protective custody. Prison officials recognized that Sarmiento would be a target for violence from other inmates, many of whom, despite their own criminal histories, reserved special hatred for child abusers. He was placed in isolation for his own protection, spending 23 hours per day in a small cell with minimal human contact. The aftermath of the trial rippled through Colombian society in unexpected ways. Victims' advocacy groups formed, demanding reforms in how abuse allegations were handled, particularly when they involved authority figures. Laws were strengthened requiring mandatory reporting of suspected child abuse, with criminal penalties for officials who failed to report. The Catholic Church in Colombia faced intense public pressure to reform its transfer policies, improve oversight of priests, and create transparent mechanisms for investigating abuse allegations. The Church's response was grudging and incomplete. Officials issued statements deploring Sarmiento's crimes but resisted characterizing them as systemic failures. They implemented some reforms, background checks for seminary candidates, policies requiring 2 adults present during any private interactions with minors, creation of review boards to examine complaints. But critics argued these measures were insufficient, that the fundamental culture of clerical privilege and institutional self-protection remained intact. Several high-ranking church officials who'd been involved in transferring Sarmiento were quietly reassigned to administrative positions with no public accountability. For the survivors, the trial brought mixed outcomes. Many described feeling validated, finally believed after years of carrying their trauma in silence. The guilty verdicts and harsh sentence provided a sense of justice, proof that they'd been wronged and that society recognized it. Support groups formed where survivors could connect, share experiences, and support each other's healing processes. Some found the strength to pursue therapy, to address the psychological damage Sarmiento had inflicted, to begin rebuilding lives that had been derailed by his abuse. But healing was not universal or complete. Several survivors struggled with substance abuse, failed relationships, and chronic depression linked directly to their childhood trauma. At least 3 committed suicide in the years following the trial, unable to escape the psychological wounds Sarmiento had inflicted. Others simply disappeared, unwilling or unable to engage with the public nature of the trial and its aftermath, preferring to process their pain privately or not at all. The families of murdered victims faced an even more difficult path. For some, recovering their children's remains and finally knowing what had happened provided closure. Funerals could finally be held, graves properly marked, the ambiguity of disappearance replaced with the terrible certainty of death. But for families whose children were never found, and investigators believed there were many, the torment continued. They lived with the knowledge that their sons or daughters had likely fallen victim to Sarmiento, but without bodies, without confirmation, without the finality that allows grief to eventually soften. Efren Sarmiento Cuero adjusted to prison life with the same emotional flatness he'd displayed throughout his trial. Guards reported that he maintained a rigid daily routine, spent most of his time reading religious texts, and showed no interest in interacting with other inmates or participating in prison programs. He refused all media interview requests, declined visits from family members who disowned him, and maintained his innocence in the few conversations he had with prison chaplains, though no priest from his original diocese would minister to him. His health declined steadily. The stress of trial, the isolation of incarceration, and his own advancing age took their toll. He developed diabetes, hypertension, and eventually signs of dementia. Prison medical staff provided basic care, but nothing extraordinary. There was no public sympathy for prolonging the life of a child murderer. On November 17, 2002, Efren Sarmiento Cuero died in the prison infirmary at the age of 60. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest complicated by multiple organ failures. He had served just over 11 years of his sentence. His body was claimed by a distant relative and buried in an unmarked grave in a public cemetery, the location kept secret to prevent vandalism. No priest presided over his burial. No prayers were said. He was consigned to the earth with the same indifference he'd shown to the lives he'd destroyed. News of his death was met with mixed reactions. Some survivors expressed relief that he could never be released, never hurt anyone else, though they noted that his death came far too peacefully compared to the suffering he'd inflicted. Others felt robbed of the opportunity to confront him again, to force him to hear how his actions had affected their entire lives. A few expressed a grim satisfaction that he'd spent his final years isolated and diminished, experiencing a fraction of the powerlessness he'd once imposed on his victims. The legacy of Efren Sarmiento Cuero extends beyond his individual crimes. His case became a catalyst for broader examinations of institutional abuse in Colombia and throughout Latin America. Investigative journalists began uncovering similar patterns in other dioceses, documenting cases where priests accused of abuse had been quietly transferred, where complaints had been buried, where institutional protection had been prioritized over child safety. The scope of the problem proved vast, with Sarmiento representing not an isolated monster but one particularly prolific example of a systemic failure. Legal reforms followed, though slower than advocates wanted. Colombia strengthened statutes of limitations for child sexual abuse, recognizing that victims often need decades before they can speak about their trauma. The country implemented more robust background check systems for anyone working with children, including religious personnel. Mandatory reporting laws were expanded and enforcement strengthened, making it a crime for officials to ignore abuse allegations. The Catholic Church's response remained inadequate in the eyes of many. While individual dioceses implemented reforms, the institutional culture of protecting clerical reputation over addressing abuse persisted. Victims groups continued to push for transparency, for opening historical archives that might reveal other cases like Sarmiento's, for removing officials who'd enabled abuse through their inaction. Progress came incrementally, often only after public pressure forced action. For the town of Totoro, where Sarmiento's arrest had occurred, and for the many other communities he'd terrorized over the years, recovery was long and painful. Churches that had been central to community life saw attendance drop as faith was shaken by betrayal. Parents became hypervigilant about their children's safety, questioning everyone in positions of authority. The trust that had once been extended automatically to priests, teachers, and officials was replaced by skepticism, a protective wariness born of hard lessons. Some communities memorialized Sarmiento's victims. In Virica, a small park was dedicated to the memory of children who'd been abused or killed, a place where families could gather and remember. In San Agustin, a plaque was placed near the archaeological park listing the names of disappeared children, a permanent reminder of lives cut short. These memorials served dual purposes, honoring the victims and ensuring that what happened would never be forgotten, never be minimized, never be repeated if vigilance could prevent it. The story of Efrain Sarmiento Cuero forces uncomfortable questions about trust, authority, and institutional accountability. How does a monster operate openly for decades? How do systems designed to protect the vulnerable instead enable their victimization? What allows individuals and institutions to prioritize reputation over justice, silence over truth? The answers indict not just one man, but the structures and cultures that sheltered him, that valued obedience over questioning, that protected institutions over individuals. In the end, Sarmiento's crimes claimed far more than the confirmed victims. Every child who learned to distrust authority because of his actions, every person whose faith was destroyed by his betrayal, every community that lost its sense of safety, all bore scars from his evil. The damage radiated outward like cracks from an impact point, affecting people who never met him but who lived in the world his crimes had changed. The final tally remains uncertain. Investigators believe Sarmiento sexually abused somewhere between 72 and over 100 children during his nearly 2 decades of active predation. The number of murders is estimated between 14 confirmed victims and possibly 30 or more whose bodies were never recovered or whose deaths were never connected to him. These numbers, clinical and precise, fail to capture the human cost. The survivors who carry trauma into every relationship, the families fractured by grief, the communities that lost their innocence, the society forced to confront its own complicity in evil. Efrain Sarmiento Cuero died unmourned and unremembered except as a cautionary tale. His victims, however, are remembered, some by name, commemorated on memorials and in survivor communities, others anonymously, their stories shared in therapy sessions and support groups, and some lost entirely, children whose disappearances were never solved, whose fates remain unknown, who became statistics in the broader tragedy of his crimes. The horror of his story lies not just in the individual acts of cruelty he committed, but in how easily he committed them, how thoroughly institutions failed to stop him, how completely society's safeguards proved inadequate when confronted with predatory evil wrapped in sacred garments. His legacy is a stark reminder that monsters don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they wear trusted faces, speak reassuring words, and hide behind the very symbols meant to represent protection and goodness. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the knowledge that Sarmiento was caught almost by accident, through one boy's resistance and one investigator's persistence. How many others like him operate still, sheltered by institutions that value their own preservation over the safety of the vulnerable? How many victims suffer in silence, convinced that speaking out is futile, that authority will protect itself rather than protect them? These questions haunt the story of Efrain Sarmiento Cuero long after his death, long after his victims have worked toward healing, long after the trials and reforms and memorials. They remain unanswered, challenging us to remain vigilant, to question authority when necessary, to believe victims when they speak, and to build systems that genuinely protect rather than merely performing protection while enabling abuse. The Monsignor of murder is gone, but the lessons from his crimes, and from society's failures to stop him, endure. A dark reminder of what happens when trust is weaponized, when institutions prioritize themselves over individuals, when silence is valued more than truth. His story is finished. The work of preventing others like him continues. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4, The Demon Behind the Smile. Some men don't just kill, they erase people from existence. And Freddy Armando Valencia made sure no one would ever find them whole. They called him the friendly neighbor, the guy who'd help you move furniture on a Sunday afternoon. But behind closed doors, Freddy Armando Valencia was orchestrating a symphony of horrors that would make seasoned detectives vomit at crime scenes. This is the story of a predator who didn't just take lives. He dismembered souls, shattered families, and left a trail of blood so thick that even hardened investigators needed therapy. Welcome to the nightmare that consumed Southern California, where a monster wore the face of a friend. Freddy Armando Valencia moved through life like smoke, present but never quite solid, there but never truly seen. Born in 1971, he arrived in the United States with the typical immigrant dream, seeking opportunity in the sprawling maze of Los Angeles. But whatever darkness lived inside him didn't stay dormant for long. By the time he reached his 30s, Valencia had perfected something terrifying: the ability to make people trust him completely, right up until the moment he destroyed them. The year 2008 marked the beginning of what investigators would later call the Valencia murders, though that clinical term fails to capture the sheer brutality of what unfolded. Valencia had settled in the city of Downey, California, a working-class community where people knew their neighbors and children played in the streets until dusk. He worked odd jobs, construction mostly, the kind of labor that kept him strong and gave him access to tools that would later serve purposes their manufacturers never intended. His first known victim was a woman named Maria Santos, a 32-year-old mother of two who cleaned houses for wealthy families in nearby Beverly Hills. Maria disappeared on a Tuesday evening in March, after telling her sister she was meeting someone about a potential job. That someone was Valencia. He'd approached her at a laundromat, all smiles and warm promises about steady work at good pay. Maria, struggling to make rent, couldn't refuse. She walked into his apartment and never walked out. What happened in those walls would haunt forensic specialists for years. Valencia didn't kill quickly. He savored control, relished the power dynamics of having another human being completely at his mercy. Maria's screams were muffled by the cheap insulation and the constant rumble of nearby highway traffic. For 3 days, she suffered unimaginable torment before Valencia finally ended her life. But death wasn't the end of Maria's nightmare. It was just the transition into something worse. Valencia had prepared for this moment. In his garage, hidden behind stacks of old tires and paint cans, he'd assembled a workstation that would make a medical examiner's stomach turn. Plastic sheeting covered every surface. Industrial-strength garbage bags sat in neat stacks. A collection of saws, knives, and cutting tools hung on the wall like a butcher's arsenal. He'd even installed a heavy-duty drain in the concrete floor, complete with a hose for washing away evidence. The dismemberment process took Valencia nearly 12 hours. He worked methodically, almost surgically, separating Maria Santos into pieces small enough to transport without suspicion. Her remains were scattered across Los Angeles County, some buried in remote areas of the Angeles National Forest, others dumped in commercial dumpsters miles apart, and one particularly horrifying discovery that wouldn't surface until years later. Portions of her body fed through an industrial wood chipper at a construction site where Valencia worked. Maria's family reported her missing within 48 hours. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed everyone at the laundromat, checked her phone records. Nothing. Maria Santos had simply vanished, as if she'd never existed. Her children asked when Mommy was coming home. Her sister printed flyers and stapled them to telephone poles across the city. But Maria was already gone, scattered across the sprawling urban landscape in pieces too small to identify. Valencia felt nothing. No remorse, no fear, no guilt. If anything, he felt satisfied, like a craftsman admiring a completed project. He'd proven he could do it. Take a human life, erase all evidence, and walk away clean. The thrill of that accomplishment consumed him, became an addiction more powerful than any drug. He needed to feel it again. 6 weeks later, he found his second victim. Carlos Mendez was a 28-year-old construction worker, recently unemployed and desperate for cash. Valencia knew him from a previous job site, knew he was vulnerable. He offered Carlos work, quick money for helping move some heavy equipment. Carlos agreed immediately. His girlfriend was pregnant, bills were piling up, and Valencia seemed like a lifeline. Carlos's murder was even more brutal than Maria's. Valencia had refined his technique, learned from the first experience. He kept Carlos alive longer, extracting maximum suffering before delivering the fatal blow. The screams that echoed through Valencia's apartment that night went unnoticed by neighbors who'd learned long ago to mind their own business in a city where everyone had secrets. The dismemberment of Carlos Mendez followed the same ritualistic pattern. The garage became Valencia's temple of horror, where human beings were reduced to meat and bone. But this time, Valencia made a critical mistake. He kept a trophy. Hidden in a lockbox beneath his bed, wrapped in old newspapers, Valencia stored Carlos's wallet and identification. Not for any practical reason, but as a souvenir, a tangible reminder of his power and control. Carlos's girlfriend filed a missing person report. She told police about the job opportunity, about a man named Freddie, but she didn't know his last name or address. The investigation went nowhere. Carlos Mendez joined Maria Santos in the growing category of Los Angeles's disappeared. People who simply stopped existing, leaving behind nothing but grief and unanswered questions. Valencia's confidence grew with each successful kill. He moved through the city like a predator who'd discovered an ecosystem with no natural enemies. The police were overwhelmed with missing person cases. Hundreds of people vanished every year in Los Angeles County, most never to be found. Valencia was just one more ghost in a city full of ghosts. By late 2009, his body count had climbed to 5 confirmed victims, though investigators would later suspect the true number might be higher. Each murder followed a similar pattern. Vulnerable victims, promises of work or assistance, brutal torture sessions that lasted days, meticulous dismemberment, and scattered disposal. Valencia had become a phantom serial killer, racking up victims without leaving the kind of evidence that generates headlines or task forces. But monsters always make mistakes eventually. For Valencia, that mistake came wrapped in his own arrogance. He'd grown so confident in his methods that he stopped being careful. The garage that served as his killing floor hadn't been cleaned as thoroughly as he thought. Blood had seeped into concrete cracks, invisible to the naked eye but glowing like neon under luminol. Hair and tissue samples clung to drain pipes. DNA evidence accumulated in places Valencia never considered. The break in the case came from an unexpected source, a maintenance worker named Roberto Jimenez who'd been hired to repair the building's plumbing. Roberto noticed the unusual drain in Valencia's garage, the heavy-duty plastic sheeting, the lingering chemical smell that no amount of air freshener could mask. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. Roberto mentioned it to the building manager, who dismissed it as paranoia. But Roberto couldn't shake the feeling, so he did something that would save countless future victims. He called the police. The responding officers initially treated it as a routine check. Valencia answered the door with his characteristic smile, invited them in with the casual confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. He explained the garage setup as a workspace for construction projects, the drain as a convenience for washing tools and equipment. The officers seemed satisfied and prepared to leave. But one of them, a 20-year veteran named Detective Sarah Chun, noticed something that made her instincts scream. Beneath the chemical smell, there was something else, something organic and rotten, something that smelled like death. Detective Chun requested permission to look around more thoroughly. Valencia hesitated for just a fraction of a second, a pause so brief most people would miss it. But Chun had spent 2 decades reading body language and micro-expressions. That hesitation told her everything. She called for backup and a search warrant. The search of Valencia's apartment and garage revealed a house of horrors that would traumatize even the most experienced crime scene investigators. The lockbox under his bed contained not just Carlos Mendez's identification, but pieces from multiple victims, jewelry, driver's licenses, photographs. The garage held trace evidence from at least 7 different people. The drain pipes contained enough biological material to keep forensic labs busy for months. Freddy Armando Valencia was arrested on November 14, 2009. He didn't resist, didn't protest, didn't demand a lawyer. Instead, he smiled that same friendly smile and asked if he could finish his coffee first. That chilling calmness, that complete absence of human emotion, would become a defining characteristic of his case. The interrogation room at the Downey Police Department was standard institutional design. Gray walls, fluorescent lighting, a metal table bolted to the floor, and a mirror that everyone knew was a window. Detective Sarah Chun sat across from Freddy Armando Valencia, studying the man who'd managed to kill multiple people without generating even a whisper of suspicion. He looked ordinary, almost boring. Medium height, medium build, unremarkable features. The kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after passing on the street. But his eyes told a different story. They were flat, empty, like looking into a doll's eyes. No warmth, no fear, no humanity. Valencia waived his right to an attorney immediately, which sent up red flags for everyone watching from behind the mirror. Guilty suspects with any survival instinct demand lawyers. They know the system, understand that silence is protection. But Valencia wanted to talk. He needed to talk, because for all his careful planning and meticulous execution, he'd been performing for an audience of one himself. Now he had a captive audience of law enforcement professionals, and his narcissism couldn't resist the opportunity to showcase his work. "I want to tell you everything," Valencia said, his accent thick but his English clear. "But you have to understand, I'm not a monster. I'm an artist. What I did, it required skill, precision, planning. Nobody gives credit for that." Detective Chun kept her expression neutral, though rage boiled beneath her professional exterior. She'd seen the crime scene photos, smelled the lingering death in Valencia's garage, held the identification cards of his victims. But she needed a confession, needed details that only the killer could provide. So she played along with his delusion. "Walk me through it," she said quietly. "Start with Maria Santos." Valencia's face lit up like a child asked about Christmas morning. "Maria, sweet Maria. She was my first, you know. The first is always special. I saw her at the laundromat, struggling with her bags, and I knew immediately she was perfect. Vulnerable, desperate, trusting. The perfect combination." He described the murder in excruciating detail, speaking with the casual tone of someone recounting a fishing trip. How he'd lured Maria to his apartment with promises of cleaning work. How he'd overpowered her quickly, zip-tying her hands and covering her mouth with duct tape before she could scream effectively. How he'd kept her alive for 3 days, enjoying absolute control over another human being for the first time in his life. "The power," Valencia said, his eyes distant, lost in the memory. "That's what people don't understand. When you hold someone's life in your hands, when they beg you for mercy and you can choose to give it or not, that's godlike. That's transcendent." Chun felt bile rising in her throat but maintained composure. "And after you killed her?" Valencia's smile widened. "That's where the real work began. The killing is easy. People die quickly if you know what you're doing. But disposal? That requires intelligence, patience, creativity. I spent weeks researching, planning. Medical textbooks, hunting guides, forensic science articles. I learned everything about human anatomy, about decomposition rates, about what investigators look for. He described the dismemberment process with clinical precision. The plastic sheeting to contain blood spatter, the order of cuts to minimize mess and maximize efficiency, the disposal strategy that scattered Maria's remains across multiple counties, making reconstruction of the crime nearly impossible. He'd even researched wildlife patterns, knowing that coyotes and other scavengers would help destroy evidence buried in remote areas. Maria Santos disappeared without a trace, Valencia said proudly. Her family still had hope for months, thinking maybe she ran away, maybe she started a new life somewhere. That's beautiful in a way. I gave them hope even while their daughter was feeding forests and filling landfills. The interrogation continued for 7 hours straight. Valencia detailed each murder with the same disturbing enthusiasm. Carlos Mendez, the construction worker who'd begged for his life, promising Valencia everything he owned. Jennifer Park, a Korean-American college student Valencia had grabbed outside a convenience store. Her murder motivated purely by opportunity rather than any selection criteria. Miguel Torres, a homeless man no one would miss, kept alive for nearly a week as Valencia experimented with different torture techniques. Each story revealed new depths of depravity. Valencia had refined his craft with each victim, learning from mistakes, improving efficiency. He'd researched chemical accelerants to speed decomposition. He'd studied police procedures to understand how investigations worked and how to exploit their weaknesses. He'd even attended a forensic science conference at a local community college, sitting in the audience taking notes while experts explained exactly what evidence they looked for at crime scenes. I was smarter than all of them, Valencia boasted. These police, these detectives, they're trained to find stupid criminals. People who kill in passion, who leave obvious evidence, who crack under pressure. But someone disciplined, someone who plans carefully and executes perfectly, they have no defense against that. Detective Chun listened to hours of confession, her notepad filling with details that would be corroborated by forensic evidence. But she needed one more thing: locations. Valencia had scattered his victims across Southern California, and families deserved the closure of burial, of knowing what happened to their loved ones. Help us find them, Chin said. Tell us where they are. Valencia leaned back in his chair, considering. His ego wanted to reveal everything, to have his complete body of work laid bare for appreciation. But a small, calculating part of him understood that recovered bodies meant stronger evidence, meant reduced chances of any legal maneuvering down the line. Some of them don't exist anymore, he said finally. Nature took them, or they went through the wood chipper at work sites. But others I can show you. I remember every location. I visit them sometimes to remember. That admission, that Valencia had returned to disposal sites to relive his crimes, sent chills through everyone monitoring the interrogation. This wasn't a killer acting on impulse or compulsion. This was someone who derived ongoing pleasure from his atrocities, who treated murder as a hobby to be savored and revisited. Over the following weeks, Valencia led investigators to 7 different locations across Southern California. A remote clearing in Angeles National Forest where Maria Santos's torso had been buried under 3 feet of dirt and rocks. A drainage culvert in East Los Angeles where Carlos Mendez's remains had been stuffed into plastic bags and hidden. A construction site dumpster where Jennifer Park's body parts had been mixed with demolition debris, later transported to a landfill that took days to excavate. Each recovery operation brought horror and heartbreak. Forensic teams worked in full protective gear, sifting through dirt and refused to recover fragments of human beings. Coroners attempted to reconstruct bodies from scattered parts, matching DNA to missing person reports. Victim families were notified, asked to provide samples for comparison, forced to learn the awful truth about what had happened to their loved ones. Miguel Torres's remains were found in multiple locations, his body having been divided and disposed of over several weeks. Valencia explained, with disturbing casualness, that he'd experimented with Miguel, wanting to see how long he could keep someone alive under extreme torture. Miguel had survived 9 days in Valencia's garage, enduring horrors that psychiatrists would later say exceeded anything in documented case studies of serial torture. He was strong, Valencia said, almost admiringly. He lasted longer than I expected. I learned a lot from Miguel about human resilience, about the body's capacity to endure suffering. It informed my later work. The clinical, detached way Valencia discussed torture and murder chilled everyone involved in the investigation. This wasn't someone who killed in anger or acted on uncontrollable urges. Valencia had approached serial murder like a profession, constantly seeking to improve his skills and expand his knowledge. He kept notebooks with detailed entries about each victim, their reactions to different torture methods, how long they remained conscious, what finally broke their will to live. One notebook entry, read aloud during the interrogation, described Jennifer Park's final hours. Subject displays remarkable psychological strength despite physical deterioration. Continued to ask why even as cognitive function declined. Interesting how humans seek meaning even when no meaning exists. Final moments characterized by acceptance rather than fear. Pattern consistent across subjects. Initial resistance, desperate bargaining, anger, resignation, acceptance. Human response to mortality is disappointingly predictable. Valencia had turned human suffering into a scientific study, complete with observations and conclusions. He documented everything with the detachment of a researcher cataloging animal behavior. The notebooks filled in gaps that even his detailed confession had left open, providing investigators with a comprehensive record of his crimes that would prove invaluable during prosecution. But even with Valencia's cooperation, not all victims could be recovered. He estimated that he'd killed between 12 and 15 people, though he couldn't be certain of the exact number. Some victims had been entirely destroyed through chemical dissolution or wood chipper processing. Others had been disposed of in ways that made recovery impossible, fed into industrial incinerators at construction sites, dumped in the Pacific Ocean weighted down with concrete, buried in locations that Valencia could no longer precisely remember. I didn't keep perfect records at first, he explained. The early ones were learning experiences. I wasn't thinking about documentation or precision. But later, once I understood this was my life's work, I became more systematic. The interrogation revealed something that profilers had long theorized but rarely saw confirmed. Serial killers could function at high levels of planning and execution when motivated by ego rather than compulsion. Valencia wasn't driven by voices or irresistible urges. He killed because he wanted to, because it satisfied his need for power and control, and because he believed he was intelligent enough to get away with it indefinitely. If that maintenance worker hadn't gotten suspicious, Valencia said during one session, I'd still be free. I could have continued for years, maybe decades. I had systems in place, routines established. I was patient. That's the key that most killers miss, patience. They get greedy, sloppy, desperate for the next kill. But I spaced things out, let cooling off periods last months sometimes. Discipline is everything. By the time the interrogation concluded, Detective Chun had extracted more than 40 hours of recorded confession, detailing atrocities that would fuel nightmares for everyone involved. Valencia had provided information leading to the recovery of 7 victims, confirmed the identities of 3 more whose remains would likely never be found, and suggested the possibility of additional victims he might be forgetting. The question that haunted Chun, that would haunt her for the rest of her career, was simple. Why did he confess? Valencia could have remained silent, forced prosecutors to build a case from circumstantial evidence, exploited weaknesses in the investigation. Instead, he'd voluntarily provided everything needed to guarantee multiple life sentences or death penalty consideration. The answer, Chun realized, was ego. Valencia wanted credit for his work. He wanted people to understand his intelligence, his discipline, his artistry. He wanted his crimes documented and remembered, wanted to be studied by future investigators and profilers. In his twisted mind, confession wasn't surrender, it was legacy building. He was ensuring that Freddy Armando Valencia would never be forgotten, that his name would be spoken alongside the most notorious serial killers in American history. And in that desire for recognition, Valencia revealed the ultimate truth about himself. He wasn't special or brilliant or artistic. He was just another narcissistic predator who'd gotten lucky for a while before his arrogance led to his downfall. His crimes weren't masterworks. They were atrocities committed against vulnerable people who'd had the misfortune of crossing his path. The courtroom in downtown Los Angeles became ground zero for one of the most disturbing trials in California history. The prosecution had amassed overwhelming evidence against Freddy Armando Valencia. His detailed confessions, forensic evidence from his garage and apartment, recovered victim remains, and testimony from experts in fields ranging from forensic pathology to criminal psychology. The defense team, appointed by the court after Valencia's public defender requested to be removed from the case citing psychological distress, faced an impossible task: defending a client who'd confessed to everything and seemed proud of it. Lead prosecutor Amanda Richardson built her case methodically, starting with the disappearances that had left families shattered and communities fearful. She called Maria Santos's sister to the stand first, a strategic decision designed to humanize the victims before the jury heard graphic testimony about their deaths. Carmen Santos testified through tears, describing Maria as a devoted mother who worked multiple jobs to provide for her children, who sent money back to family in Mexico, who dreamed of one day opening her own cleaning business. Maria had been excited about the job opportunity Valencia offered, had called Carmen to say she might finally catch a financial break. That phone call was the last time Carmen heard her sister's voice. "She was everything to us," Carmen sobbed, "and he took her like she was nothing, like she didn't matter. My nephews ask me when their mama is coming home, and I have to tell them she's never coming home. How do you explain that to children? How do you tell them that a monster killed their mother and cut her into pieces?" The jury listened in silence, several members wiping away tears. Valencia showed no reaction, sitting at the defense table with the same placid expression he'd maintained throughout the investigation. His lawyer occasionally leaned over to whisper something, but Valencia rarely responded, seemingly bored by the proceedings. Richardson called family members for each identified victim, building an emotional foundation before transitioning to the forensic evidence. Carlos Mendez's pregnant girlfriend testified about how Carlos had been excited about the job opportunity, how they'd planned to name their baby after him, how she'd given birth alone while not knowing if Carlos had abandoned her or met with foul play. Jennifer Park's parents, Korean immigrants who barely spoke English, required a translator to describe their daughter's academic achievements, her dreams of becoming a doctor, the crushing weight of not knowing what happened to her for months. Each testimony hammered home the same message. These weren't just victims. They were people with families, dreams, futures. Valencia had stolen all of that, had reduced human beings to meat and scattered remains. The emotional testimony devastated the courtroom, creating an atmosphere of barely contained rage directed at the defendant. Then came the forensic evidence, and the trial shifted from emotional devastation to visceral horror. The prosecution presented crime scene photographs that made jurors gasp and cover their mouths. Valencia's garage, photographed from every angle under normal and forensic lighting, revealed the scope of his butchery. Blood traces glowed under luminol, creating constellations of violence on walls and floors. The workstation where he'd dismembered victims looked like something from a torture museum. Dr. Patricia Harmon, the forensic pathologist who'd examined the recovered remains, provided testimony that several jurors would later say haunted their dreams. She described in clinical detail the injuries found on victim remains, the evidence of prolonged torture, the precise nature of the dismemberment process. Her testimony lasted 3 full days, walking the jury through each victim's final hours based on forensic evidence. The pattern of injuries suggests extended periods of torture, Dr. Harmon explained, pointing to enlarged photographs that made several spectators flee the courtroom. "We found evidence of burns, lacerations, blunt force trauma, and systematic breaking of bones before death occurred. The victims were kept alive and conscious during much of this torture. We know this because of healing patterns in some injuries and the presence of stress hormones in tissue samples." The defense objected repeatedly, arguing that the graphic nature of the testimony was prejudicial. Judge Raymond Foster overruled each objection, noting that the jury needed to understand the full scope of Valencia's crimes to render an appropriate verdict. Dr. Harmon's most damning testimony came when describing the dismemberment process. "Whoever did this had knowledge of human anatomy and butchery techniques. The cuts were precise, made at joints and natural separation points to minimize effort. This wasn't frenzied hacking, this was methodical, almost surgical. The perpetrator took his time, worked carefully, showed no hesitation in the cut marks. When asked if she'd seen similar dismemberment in other cases, Dr. Harmon paused before answering. I've worked in forensic pathology for 23 years and examined remains from hundreds of homicides. I've never seen dismemberment this thorough or this carefully executed. Most killers who dismember victims do so out of panic, trying to hide evidence. This was different. This was someone who approached dismemberment as a craft to be perfected. The prosecution then presented Valencia's notebooks, reading selected passages to the jury. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as Valencia's clinical observations about torture and death were recited. His descriptions of victims' suffering, written in neat handwriting with charts and diagrams, revealed a mind completely disconnected from human empathy. One entry described experimenting with different blade types to determine optimal cutting efficiency. Another detailed his observations about how long victims remained conscious during various torture methods. A third included sketches showing the most efficient sequence for dismembering a human body to minimize cleanup. These aren't the writings of someone acting on impulse, Richardson argued. This is a man who studied killing the way others study music or art. He dedicated himself to becoming an expert in murder and torture. Every victim was a learning experience, every killing an opportunity to refine his technique. The defense strategy, such as it was, attempted to argue diminished capacity, that Valencia's disturbing calm and lack of remorse indicated severe mental illness that prevented him from understanding the wrongfulness of his actions. They called their own psychiatric expert, Dr. Kenneth Morris, who'd evaluated Valencia over several weeks. Dr. Morris testified that Valencia exhibited characteristics consistent with severe antisocial personality disorder and potentially psychopathy. He shows complete absence of empathy, inability to form genuine emotional connections, and views other human beings as objects rather than people. His confessions demonstrate intellectual understanding of societal rules but no internalized moral framework. But on cross-examination, Richardson demolished the diminished capacity argument. Dr. Morris, did Mr. Valencia understand that killing people was illegal? Yes. Did he take steps to avoid detection? Yes, extensive steps. Did he research forensic science to understand how to avoid leaving evidence? Yes, he did. Did he carefully select vulnerable victims who wouldn't be immediately missed? That appears to be the case, yes. So Mr. Valencia understood right from wrong, understood the consequences of his actions, and took extensive precautions to avoid those consequences. That's not diminished capacity, Dr. Morris. That's premeditation. The defense had no effective response. Valencia's own actions, his research, his planning, his careful victim selection, proved he understood exactly what he was doing and knew it was wrong. The insanity defense crumbled under the weight of Valencia's own meticulous preparations. Perhaps the most chilling moment of the trial came when Valencia himself took the stand. His attorney had strongly advised against it, but Valencia insisted. He wanted his moment in the spotlight, his opportunity to explain himself to the world. Richardson approached the cross-examination carefully, knowing that Valencia's narcissism could be exploited. She began with simple questions, establishing the basic facts of each murder. Valencia answered calmly, confirming details from his confession. Then Richardson shifted tactics. Mr. Valencia, you've described your crimes as artistic, as requiring skill and intelligence. Tell me, what artistic value does torturing a pregnant woman's boyfriend have? Valencia's expression flickered, a micro moment of irritation at the question's framing. You're simplifying something complex. The art isn't in any individual act. It's in the totality of the work. The planning, the execution, the successful concealment. Each victim was part of a larger project. A project. Is that how you think of Maria Santos? As part of a project. Yes, she was the foundation. Everything built from there. And Jennifer Park? The college student with dreams of becoming a doctor? What was she? An opportunity. I saw potential and I acted. Potential for what, Mr. Valencia? To torture and kill a young woman. Potential to expand my capabilities. To test my limits. Richardson paused, letting Valencia's words hang in the courtroom. The jury stared at him with undisguised horror. He'd just described a murder victim as an opportunity to test his limits, as casually as someone might describe trying a new recipe. Do you feel any remorse for what you've done? Valencia considered the question seriously, not rushing to answer. Remorse implies I believe I did something wrong. I don't share society's view that human life has inherent value. Life is just a biological process. I interrupted that process in several cases, but the universe doesn't care. Consciousness ends, organic matter decomposes, and existence continues. My actions had no cosmic significance. What about their families? The children left without parents? Do you feel anything about their suffering? Their emotional responses are their own. I'm not responsible for how other people feel. Richardson pressed harder. Maria Santos's children cry for their mother every night. Carlos Mendez's daughter will grow up without ever meeting her father. Jennifer Park's parents had to identify their daughter from partial remains. You caused all of that suffering. You're telling this jury you feel nothing. Valencia's expression remained flat. Correct. I feel nothing. Their pain doesn't affect me. Their grief is meaningless to me. I'm not capable of the emotional response you're trying to provoke. That admission, cold, direct, unfiltered, sealed Valencia's fate more effectively than any forensic evidence could have. He'd revealed himself completely, shown the jury a human being utterly void of humanity. Whatever sympathy might have existed for a potentially mentally ill defendant evaporated in the face of Valencia's casual indifference to suffering. The defense attempted redirect, trying to frame Valencia's statements as evidence of psychological impairment. But the damage was done. The jury had seen behind the mask and found nothing there. No person, no soul, just an empty void wearing human skin. Closing arguments lasted 2 full days. Richardson delivered a passionate summation that connected evidence to emotion, forensic facts to human tragedy. She methodically walked through each murder, each act of torture, each moment of victim suffering. She reminded the jury that Valencia had researched and planned every detail, that he'd refined his technique with each killing, that he'd kept trophies and notebooks documenting his work. The defense wants you to believe that Freddy Valencia is sick, that his actions stem from mental illness beyond his control, Richardson said, her voice rising. But the evidence shows something different. It shows a man who knew exactly what he was doing, who planned meticulously, who studied forensic science to avoid detection. This isn't mental illness, this is evil. Pure, calculating, predatory evil. And evil deserves punishment. The defense's closing argument, delivered by attorney Michael Chun, was brief and half-hearted. Chun acknowledged the horror of the crimes but urged the jury to consider mental illness as a mitigating factor. Nobody mentally healthy does what Freddy Valencia did. His complete absence of empathy, his inability to understand human emotion. These are symptoms of profound psychological impairment. He needs treatment, not execution. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman read the verdicts in a steady voice that nevertheless conveyed the emotional weight of the moment. Guilty on all counts. 7 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, torture, multiple victims, and lying in wait. The special circumstances findings made Valencia eligible for the death penalty. The sentencing phase lasted another week. The prosecution argued for death, presenting impact statements from victim families that left the courtroom in tears. Carmen Santos described her nephew's ongoing trauma, how they wake up screaming from nightmares about what happened to their mother. Carlos Mendez's daughter, now 5 years old, drew pictures of her father that showed him as an angel in heaven, a father she'd never met because Valencia had butchered him before she was born. The defense presented mitigation testimony, childhood abuse, neglect, poverty. But compared to the magnitude of Valencia's crimes, these factors felt inadequate. Yes, Valencia had suffered, but so had millions of others who didn't become serial killers. His traumatic past couldn't excuse or explain the deliberate, calculated nature of his crimes. Judge Foster sentenced Valencia to death, calling him one of the most dangerous individuals ever to appear before this court. He imposed consecutive life sentences for each murder, ensuring that even if the death penalty were overturned, Valencia would never be released. Valencia showed no reaction to the sentence. As bailiffs led him from the courtroom, he turned and smiled at the gallery, that same friendly smile that had lured so many victims to their deaths. It was a final act of cruelty, a reminder that some monsters never stop being monsters, even when they've lost everything. Death row at San Quentin State Prison became Freddy Armando Valencia's final home. The fortress-like complex overlooking San Francisco Bay houses California's most dangerous criminals, men whose names have become synonymous with nightmares. Valencia joined their ranks, assigned to a single-occupant cell where he would spend 23 hours a day isolated from other inmates. But even death row couldn't contain the aftershocks of Valencia's crimes. His case became a watershed moment in California law enforcement, exposing critical gaps in missing person investigations and interagency communication. Multiple victims had been reported missing across different jurisdictions: Los Angeles County, Orange County, San Bernardino County, but no centralized database connected the cases. Valencia had exploited this fragmentation, understanding that law enforcement agencies often worked in silos. Detective Sarah Chun, the officer whose instincts had led to Valencia's capture, became an advocate for reform. She testified before the California State Legislature, describing how better information sharing might have caught Valencia after his second or third victim instead of his seventh. Her testimony contributed to the creation of the California Missing Persons Database, a centralized system that allowed agencies across the state to share information and identify potential patterns. Valencia succeeded partly because he was careful, Chun told legislators, but also because our system made it easy for him. A missing person in Los Angeles wasn't connected to a missing person in Orange County. We were investigating trees while Valencia was burning down the forest. The forensic evidence recovered from Valencia's garage advanced several investigative techniques. The drain system he'd installed became a case study in how killers adapt to forensic science. Valencia had researched what investigators looked for and specifically designed his killing space to minimize typical evidence markers. But he'd underestimated modern forensic capabilities, DNA extraction techniques that could pull profiles from minute tissue samples, luminol applications that revealed blood traces months old, and forensic archaeology methods that could recover remains from challenging disposal sites. Dr. Patricia Harmon, the forensic pathologist who testified at trial, published research papers using Valencia's case as a foundation. Her work on dismemberment patterns and torture identification became required reading in forensic pathology programs. Valencia's meticulous documentation, horrifying as it was, provided unprecedented insight into serial killer psychology and methodology. But the deepest scars remained with the victims' families. Carmen Santos never recovered from Maria's murder. She raised Maria's 2 children as her own, but the trauma of losing her sister in such a horrific way manifested in severe depression and anxiety. Carmen underwent years of therapy, joined support groups for families of murder victims, and eventually became a victim's advocate herself. She testified at parole hearings for other violent offenders, ensuring that victim voices remained central to the justice system. But the nightmares never stopped. Images of what her sister endured in those final days, reconstructed from trial testimony and her own dark imagination. People think closure comes from a conviction, Carmen said during a victim advocacy conference 5 years after Valencia's sentencing. But there is no closure. Maria is still gone. Her children still grow up without their mother. I still see her face in my dreams, begging for help that never came. Justice doesn't heal that wound. It just stops the bleeding temporarily. Carlos Mendez's daughter, Isabella, grew up with a ghost for a father. Her mother remarried eventually, and Isabella gained a stepfather who loved her genuinely. But she always knew about Carlos, always understood that a monster had stolen her biological father before she could take her first breath. On her 10th birthday, Isabella asked her mother to take her to Carlos's grave, one of the few victims whose remains had been recovered intact enough for burial. Isabella stood at the gravestone, holding a drawing she'd made of what she imagined her father looked like. "I made this for you," she whispered to the ground. "Mom says you were funny and strong and you would have loved me. I wish the bad man hadn't taken you away." Her mother, watching from a distance, wept silently. Valencia had murdered more than Carlos. He'd murdered the future Carlos would have had, the relationship he'd have built with his daughter, the life Isabella deserved with her father. Jennifer Park's parents never recovered. Her father, a devout Christian who'd immigrated to America with dreams of providing his daughter opportunities unavailable in Korea, lost his faith entirely. How could a benevolent God allow something so evil to exist? How could Jennifer, who'd volunteered at homeless shelters and tutored underprivileged children, be tortured to death while her killer walked the earth feeling nothing? Jennifer's mother retreated into silence. She stopped speaking almost entirely, communicating only through nods and head shakes. Psychiatrists diagnosed severe traumatic stress disorder with dissociative features. Her mind had essentially shut down to protect itself from unbearable pain. She spent her days in a chair by the window, staring at nothing, occasionally whispering Jennifer's name. The Park family sued the apartment complex where Valencia lived, arguing that inadequate security had enabled his crimes. The case settled quietly, the complex's insurance paying out substantial damages. But no amount of money could restore what had been taken. The Parks moved back to Korea eventually, unable to remain in a country where their daughter had been murdered and dismembered. Miguel Torres, the homeless man Valencia had kept alive for 9 days, had no family to mourn him. His remains were buried in a county cemetery, a simple marker bearing his name and dates. Social workers who'd known Miguel described him as a kind soul defeated by addiction and mental illness, a veteran who'd served his country and received nothing but abandonment in return. Valencia had targeted him specifically because he knew no one would miss Miguel, that his disappearance would generate no investigation. A homeless advocacy group adopted Miguel's grave, maintaining it as a memorial to all the nameless, forgotten victims of violence. Every Veterans Day, volunteers place a flag on his marker and read his name aloud. It's a small dignity, but one that acknowledges Miguel Torres existed, mattered, and deserved better than what he received. The case's impact rippled through law enforcement psychology. Police academies began teaching Valencia's case as an example of successful serial killing. What happens when intelligence, patience, and complete lack of empathy combine in a single predator? Criminal psychology courses dissected his methodology, using his notebooks and confessions to understand how organized serial killers think and operate. FBI profilers studied Valencia extensively, incorporating his case into behavioral analysis frameworks. His victim selection strategy, targeting vulnerable, marginalized individuals unlikely to generate immediate investigation, became a warning sign that profilers now actively look for in missing person clusters. Valencia represents the evolution of serial killing, explained FBI Supervisory Special Agent Marcus Williams during a training seminar. He studied forensic science, researched police procedures, and adapted his methodology based on that knowledge. He's what we call an informed killer, someone who understands the system and exploits its weaknesses. These are the most dangerous predators because they operate at the edge of our detection capabilities. On death row, Valencia maintained his disturbing calm. He gave interviews to researchers and journalists, always eager to discuss his crimes and methodology. True crime writers competed for access, hoping to pen the definitive account of his killing spree. Valencia enjoyed the attention, the recognition that he'd achieved the notoriety he'd craved. In one interview with a criminal psychology researcher, Valencia was asked if he understood why people considered him evil. He thought carefully before responding. "I understand that my actions violated social norms and legal codes. I understand that I caused suffering to individuals and their families. What I don't understand is the assumption that I should care about those things. Empathy isn't a choice, you either have it or you don't. I don't. Asking me to feel remorse is like asking a blind person to describe colors." The researcher pressed further. "But you understand intellectually that you caused harm, that you destroyed lives. Doesn't that intellectual understanding create any moral obligation?" Valencia smiled, that same unsettling smile that had haunted trial footage. Morality is a social construct designed to facilitate cooperation among humans who evolved as pack animals. I acknowledge its utility for maintaining civilization, but it has no inherent reality, no objective truth. I violated societal rules and am suffering consequences. That's the extent of it. Your expectation that I should feel guilty about violating artificial constraints is, frankly, irrational. These interviews revealed Valencia's fundamental deficiency. Not a lack of intelligence, but a complete absence of the emotional architecture that makes humans social beings. He could mimic appropriate responses, understand intellectually why people felt certain ways, but genuine empathy remained forever beyond his capacity. Psychiatrists debated whether Valencia was born with this deficit or whether childhood trauma had destroyed his ability to connect emotionally. His background revealed significant early abuse: an alcoholic father, a neglectful mother, poverty, and violence. But millions of people endure similar circumstances without becoming serial killers. The nature versus nurture debate found no resolution in Valencia's case. Only the grim reality that his particular combination of genetics and environment had produced a predator. The investigation's aftermath also revealed potential additional victims. Detectives identified 4 more missing person cases from Valencia's geographic area and time period that fit his victim profile. But without confessions or forensic evidence, these cases remained technically unsolved. Valencia claimed he couldn't remember everyone he'd killed, that some early victims had blurred together in memory. There might be 12, might be 15, he told investigators during a follow-up interview. I didn't keep good records at first. Some victims were opportunistic, wrong place, wrong time. I probably couldn't identify them from photographs even if you showed me. That uncertainty tormented families of missing persons throughout Southern California. Was their loved one a Valencia victim? Had they been tortured and dismembered, scattered across the landscape? Or had something else happened? The lack of definitive answers created a special kind of anguish, knowing Valencia was responsible for unidentified murders but being unable to confirm specific cases. Cold case detectives continued working Valencia-related investigations years after his conviction. They re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined forensic evidence with updated technology, and periodically visited Valencia hoping new information might emerge. Some cases were eventually closed based on circumstantial connections, bringing painful closure to families. Others remained open, ghosts haunting filing cabinets in police stations across Southern California. The maintenance worker whose suspicions had triggered Valencia's capture, Roberto Jimenez, struggled with his own trauma. He'd saved unknown numbers of future victims by reporting his concerns, but he was also haunted by what he'd witnessed. The garage he'd entered innocently, just trying to fix plumbing, had been a charnel house. Roberto underwent therapy for post-traumatic stress, experiencing nightmares and intrusive thoughts about what had happened in that space. I see blood everywhere now, Roberto told his therapist. I know it's not real, that it's my mind playing tricks, but sometimes I look at a floor drain and imagine what went through Valencia's drain. I can't unsee what I saw, can't unknow what I know. I'm glad I reported him, glad I potentially saved lives. But I wish I'd never walked into that garage. Detective Sarah Chen faced her own psychological aftermath. She'd interrogated Valencia for dozens of hours, heard details of torture and murder that would sicken the most hardened investigators. She'd looked into the eyes of absolute evil and seen nothing looking back, just emptiness where a soul should be. Chun took a 6-month sabbatical after the trial, spending time with family and undergoing her own therapy. She considered leaving law enforcement entirely, wondering if she could continue in a profession that exposed her to humanity's darkest expressions. But ultimately, she returned to work, driven by the knowledge that investigators like her stood between predators and potential victims. Someone has to do this work, Chen explained to a colleague. Someone has to catch monsters. Valencia taught me that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears a friendly smile and helps you carry groceries. My job is to see through that disguise, to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. I owe that to future victims, to the people Valencia might inspire, to every family destroyed by predators. The trial's most disturbing revelation came months after sentencing, when forensic accountants examining Valencia's financial records discovered he'd been researching property purchases in remote areas of California and Nevada. Bank statements showed he'd visited rural land sales websites, inquired about parcels with no nearby neighbors, and even made preliminary offers on 2 properties. Investigators realized with chilling certainty what Valencia had been planning: a permanent killing facility, a remote location where he could torture victims indefinitely without fear of discovery. He'd been building toward an evolution in his methodology, transitioning from opportunistic kills in his garage to a dedicated space purpose-built for murder. If he'd succeeded in purchasing that property, Detective Chun said, there's no telling how many people would have died. He could have operated for decades, bringing victims to a location completely isolated from witnesses or surveillance. The maintenance workers' suspicions literally saved dozens, maybe hundreds of potential future victims. That realization provided some comfort to the families, knowing that Valencia's capture had prevented not just additional murders, but a potential escalation into something even more monstrous. He'd been stopped early in his evolution, before he could fully realize his dark ambitions. Years passed. Valencia remained on death row, California's dysfunctional capital punishment system ensuring he'd likely die of natural causes before execution. He continued granting interviews, writing letters to researchers, and maintaining correspondence with true crime enthusiasts fascinated by his case. His notoriety grew, his name mentioned alongside Bundy, Gacy, and Dahmer, exactly the legacy he'd sought. But for the families of his victims, Valencia's fame meant something different. It meant their loved ones would forever be associated with a monster, remembered primarily as entries on a serial killer's victim list. Maria Santos, Carlos Mendez, Jennifer Park, Miguel Torres, their names appeared in true crime documentaries and forensic science textbooks, but rarely with context about who they'd been before becoming victims. Carmen Santos fought against this erasure. She created a website documenting Maria's life. Photographs from childhood, stories from friends and family, videos of Maria laughing with her children. She wanted the world to remember Maria as more than Valencia's first known victim, to understand the fullness of the life he'd destroyed. My sister was a person, Carmen wrote on the website's homepage. She had dreams, fears, hopes, and love. She made the best pozole in our entire family. She could make anyone laugh, even on their worst days. She sacrificed everything for her children. That's who Maria Santos was. Not just a name on a victim list, but a complete human being with a life that mattered. Other families followed Carmen's example, creating memorials that celebrated their loved ones' lives rather than focusing on their deaths. Carlos Mendez's girlfriend posted videos of Carlos working on cars, his passion and skill evident in every movement. Jennifer Park's college friends shared essays she'd written, poetry she'd composed, evidence of the brilliant mind Valencia had extinguished. These memorials served dual purposes: honoring the victims and refusing to let Valencia's evil define their entire existence. The families wanted the world to know that their loved ones were more than statistics, more than case studies in serial killer methodology. They were people who'd loved and been loved, who'd had impact and meaning, whose absence created voids that could never be filled. The California criminal justice system's handling of Valencia's case became a model for prosecuting serial killers with extensive forensic evidence and detailed confessions. Law schools studied the trial transcripts, examining prosecution strategy and jury selection. The case demonstrated how emotional testimony could be balanced with scientific evidence, how to present horrifying facts without alienating jurors through trauma. But perhaps the most important legacy was the systemic changes Valencia's case inspired. The improved missing persons database prevented several other serial killers from operating undetected for extended periods. Enhanced interagency communication meant patterns could be identified earlier. Training protocols taught officers to recognize signs of serial predation that might otherwise go unnoticed. Valencia's capture and conviction probably prevented more murders than we'll ever know about, explained victim advocate Martha Rodriguez during a criminal justice conference. Not just his own future victims, but others who might have operated using similar methodology. The systemic improvements his case inspired have made it harder for serial killers to function. That's cold comfort for the families he destroyed, but it means something for the families who were spared. As years accumulated, Valencia's case took on an almost mythological quality in true crime circles. New details continued emerging as investigators followed leads and evidence was reanalyzed with advancing technology. But the fundamental horror remained unchanged. A predator had operated in plain sight, destroying lives while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Freddy Armando Valencia represented something deeply unsettling about human nature, the capacity for absolute evil to exist behind a mask of mundane ordinariness. He wasn't a Hollywood monster with obvious warning signs. He was a neighbor, a coworker, someone who'd help jumpstart your car. And that ordinariness made him more terrifying than any fiction could capture. The victims of Freddy Valencia deserved better than what they received. They deserved to live their lives, raise their children, pursue their dreams. Instead, they encountered a human-shaped void that consumed them entirely, reducing their existence to evidence in forensic reports and testimony in courtroom trials. Their families continue living with that loss, carrying grief that never fully heals. Every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary moment contains the shadow of absence. The monster who created that absence sits on death row, unchanged and unrepentant, a permanent reminder that some evil cannot be rehabilitated or redeemed. This is the legacy of Freddy Armando Valencia. Not just the lives he took, but the families he shattered, the innocence he destroyed, and the grim lesson he taught about humanity's capacity for cruelty. His name will be remembered, but so will theirs. Maria Santos, Carlos Mendez, Jennifer Park, Miguel Torres, and the others whose names we may never know, whose remains were scattered too thoroughly to identify, whose families still wait for answers that may never come. In the end, Valencia achieved his goal of notoriety. But he also created something he never intended, a determination among investigators, advocates, and families to ensure that victims are remembered as people, not just statistics, that their lives mattered more than his crimes, that love and memory can persist even when confronted by absolute evil. The monster hunted his prey methodically, carefully, convinced of his own brilliance. But the monster underestimated human resilience, the strength of families to honor their dead, and the determination of society to adapt and protect itself against predators. Valencia may have won individual battles, but he lost the war for meaning and legacy. He sits in a cell, alive but completely alone, having destroyed others' lives while creating nothing of value in his own. His victims, though dead, live on in memory, in the love of those who knew them, in the systematic changes their deaths inspired. In that sense, they achieved a victory Valencia never will. Their lives, however shortened, had meaning and impact that transcended their tragic ends. The story of Freddy Armando Valencia is ultimately not his story at all. It belongs to Maria, Carlos, Jennifer, Miguel, and all the others. It belongs to the families who survived their loss. It belongs to the investigators who caught a monster. And it serves as a reminder that vigilance, compassion, and justice must remain constant in a world where predators walk among us, wearing friendly smiles and hiding monstrous intentions. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.